Have you ever looked into a pair of blue eyes and realized they may all trace back to a single ancient human, not a tribe, not a kingdom, not a civilization, but one forgotten person living thousands of years ago, whose tiny genetic mutation quietly changed the appearance of millions? Tonight, we follow that strange inheritance across Ice Age landscapes, vanished ancestors, and the deep mystery of how one small change in the human body survived forever. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The first blue eyes do not appear as a grand event. There is no ceremony for them, no carved record, no ancient witness pausing beside a river or beneath a stand of birch trees to note that something in the human face has changed. They arrive in silence, inside the body of one person who does not know he or she is carrying a novelty that will outlast kingdoms, languages, gods, and entire ways of life. Somewhere in the long, cold reaches of prehistoric Eurasia, amid populations already hardened by movement, hunger, winter light, and the constant demands of survival, a mutation appears that shifts the way pigment is controlled in the iris. It is tiny. It does not announce itself with strength or weakness. It does not make a spear fly straighter or a fire burn longer. And yet, over thousands of years, that small change begins to travel. It passes through children, then grandchildren, then through people who cross forests, shorelines, plains, and frozen margins of a continent still recovering from ice. Eventually it alters the appearance of millions. That is the strange power of the story. Blue eyes feel familiar now, almost ordinary in some parts of the world, folded into modern life so completely that they can seem timeless. But they are not timeless. They have a beginning. They belong to history. More than that, they belong to prehistory, to a chapter of the human story so distant that almost everything around this mutation has vanished. The shelters are gone. The voices are gone. The names are gone. The fears, loyalties, rituals, rivalries, and private griefs of the people who first carried this trait have dissolved into silence. What remains is a faint genetic trail, and a question that seems simple until one looks closely at it. How did one rare mutation, arising in one human line, become so visible in the world? And what does that tell us about the ancient people who carried it forward? The answer does not begin with colour alone. It begins with survival in a difficult world, in landscapes shaped by ice, retreating glaciers, raw coastlines, open tundra, marshes, and forests still finding their place after immense climatic upheaval. The human beings moving through these environments are not modern people in the shallow sense of the word, dressed in recent habits and familiar assumptions. They are modern in the deeper biological sense. They are people like us in mind and body, yet living in conditions that strip life down to its oldest terms. Food must be found, stored, shared, or fought over. Children must survive infancy. Bodies must endure cold, infection, injury, and distance. Small groups drift, split, reunite, and vanish. In such a world, appearance is never merely cosmetic. The face is kinship, recognition, selection, memory. It is the surface through which one person reads another. So the origin of blue eyes is not a decorative footnote in human history. It is part of a larger and more intimate story about how populations change, how rare traits survive, and how chance can become legacy. Modern genetics suggests that the common blue-eye trait in living humans traces back to a shared ancestral mutation, one that likely emerged several thousand years after the first modern humans entered Europe. Scholars still debate the exact timing and context, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the broad outline is remarkable enough. A trait that seems diverse in its modern expressions may have passed through an extraordinarily narrow doorway in the past. In effect, many blue-eyed people alive today may carry the legacy of a single prehistoric event inherited across countless generations. That does not mean every shade, variation, or genetic influence on eye color is identical, because biology is rarely so neat. But what survives in the record suggests a surprisingly focused origin. This is where the story begins to feel almost unsettling. Human history is full of empires, revolutions, plagues, inventions, migrations, and wars, the great visible machinery of change. Yet some of the most enduring transformations are quieter than all of these. A shift in the regulation of pigment, a child born with an unfamiliar gaze, a family line in which the uncommon is not erased. The origin of blue eyes belongs to that quieter category. It asks us to imagine deep time not as a blur of crude ancestors, but as a sequence of intimate lives in which the future is carried invisibly inside the body. Someone once looked into the face of a child and saw eyes, unlike the usual brown known to their people. Perhaps they seemed striking, perhaps unsettling, perhaps beautiful. Perhaps they meant nothing at all beside the urgent practicalities of weather and food. No single explanation fully accounts for how such a trait first moved through human groups, but once it appeared, it entered the oldest force in history, inheritance. And inheritance is never simple. It passes not through abstraction, but through births that happen or do not happen, through families that endure or fail, through accidents of survival so ordinary they leave no memorial. A storm kills one line and spares another. A mother survives childbirth. A boy reaches adulthood. A girl crosses into another camp and has children there. A winter is harsh, but not harsh enough. A group finds fish where it expected none. A settlement on a lake edge lasts 3 generations longer than probability might suggest. In the long mathematics of ancestry, almost everything is fragile. Most lives leave no detectable trace. Most mutations vanish. The origin of blue eyes therefore depends not only on biology, but on luck so persistent that it starts to resemble destiny once viewed from a distance. There is also a deeper human fascination at work. Eye color is not like blood type, or enzyme activity, or some internal anatomical variation hidden from daily life. Eyes meet eyes. People notice them. Across cultures and centuries, human beings have read meaning into gaze, brightness, darkness, clarity, and contrast. Entire poetic traditions has clung to eyes as signs of character, desire, otherness, innocence, danger, beauty, and memory. Ancient people were no less observant than modern ones. They may have lacked the language of genes and mutations, but they knew faces, they knew resemblance. They knew the shock of difference inside familiarity. If blue eyes first spread in small populations, then for a long time they would not have been a broad regional feature. They would have been personal, a trait attached to specific individuals, households, and lineages. That makes the early history of blue eyes feel less like a map and more like a campfire scene, a shoreline, a burial, a family. Yet the further back this story goes, the more careful the ground becomes. The temptation is to turn the origin of blue eyes into myth, a northern tribe under pale skies, a beautiful stranger, a favoured lineage, a dramatic adaptation to climate. Popular imagination likes clean causes and vivid symbols. The real past is less obedient. Science can identify patterns, dates, and probabilities, but it does not resurrect the emotional life of a mutation. It cannot tell us whether the first blue-eyed person was admired, ignored, mocked, feared, or simply loved as a child among kin. It cannot tell us what stories, if any, gathered around unusual appearance in those early communities. The evidence can point toward shared ancestry, genetic pathways, and population movement. It cannot fully restore the social texture in which those eyes were first seen. That uncertainty matters. It keeps the story honest. Still, even with uncertainty, the outline retains its force. Blue eyes are not an ancient universal. They are a development. They emerge from the wider history of Homo sapiens, a species that originates in Africa, spreads outward in waves, adapts to new environments, and accumulates variation over time. For most of that journey, the ancestors of modern humans almost certainly carry dark eyes, rich in melanin, well suited to ancestral conditions and deeply rooted in our species' earlier biology. The mutation associated with blue eyes appears later, after humans have already endured migrations, climatic strain, and local isolation. That means blue eyes are not primordial in the human story. They are a relatively recent experiment within it, though recent here still means many thousands of years. They belong not to the dawn of humanity, but to one of its later, colder, more regionally tangled chapters. What makes that chapter so compelling is that it combines scale with intimacy. On the one hand, this is a story about continents, climate shifts, gene flow, and ancient demography. On the other hand, it comes down to a detail visible from a few feet away. Entire civilizations can rise and vanish without changing the basic architecture of the human face. But one ancient mutation can persist so stubbornly that it survives every empire that comes later. Rome does not create it. Egypt does not record its beginning. Sumer does not name it. The first temples, bronze blades, and written laws all belong to a world already far downstream from its origin. Blue eyes are older than those monuments in the populations where they first appear, yet younger than humanity itself by an immense margin. They sit in that eerie middle distance of time where the human story begins to look both familiar and alien. And there is one more reason this mystery matters. It challenges the easy assumption that what is common now must always have been common, or that visible traits map neatly onto the categories later societies invent around them. The ancient world does not recognize modern racial ideas, and the populations who first carried blue-eye mutations do not fit comfortably into the myths later centuries would build around European appearance. The story is more complicated, more surprising, and often more contradictory than popular memory allows. That is part of its value. It reveals how fragile modern certainties can be when placed against the evidence of deep time. A single trait, taken for granted in millions of faces, turns out to be the survivor of migrations, bottlenecks, mixing, and long-forgotten human experiments in living under difficult skies. So the mystery opens not in a palace or battlefield, but in a human body, somewhere in prehistory, in a world without written names. A mutation begins its journey. It does not know where it will end. It will pass through hunters and gatherers, through people who stand on windy coasts and among wet forests, through communities that disappear without record, through later populations transformed by farming, migration, and war. It will be folded into the faces of people who speak languages not yet born, and into histories that will someday misuse it, romanticize it, politicize it, and misunderstand it. But at the beginning there is only the small ancient fact itself, one change, one lineage, one improbable survival. Out of that silence, a new human appearance enters the world and never entirely leaves it. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. To understand how that change becomes possible, it helps to step back from the colour itself and look at the older human inheritance it interrupts. Because before blue eyes spread, before northern populations carry them in visible numbers, before later myths try to explain them away, the human face has a different baseline. The first part of this story is not the arrival of blue, but the long age before it. When brown eyes dominate the species and the ancestral human world still holds the older pattern almost everywhere. For almost the entire human story, blue eyes do not exist. That is the first fact worth holding steady, because modern familiarity can flatten the scale of the past. Today, eye colour appears as a spectrum, something people casually observe in mirrors, family photographs, passport lines, classrooms, and city streets. Brown, hazel, green, grey, blue. The range can feel natural, even inevitable. But in evolutionary terms, diversity does not arrive all at once, and it does not spread evenly. Long before the first blue-eyed child appears in prehistoric Eurasia, the human species already carries an older visual inheritance. Dark eyes are the norm. They are not an exception waiting to be replaced. They are the ancestral condition, rooted deep in the biology of Homo sapiens and beyond that, in the older primate story from which our species emerges. That older inheritance begins under brighter skies. The earliest modern humans evolve in Africa, in landscapes that vary enormously from woodland to savanna to river systems and coasts, but which together form the ecological theatre in which the human body takes shape. Skin pigmentation, hair texture, facial variation, and eye colour all belong to a broad adaptive system influenced by ancestry, environment, and deep population history. In that system, dark irises dominate because melanin dominates. Melanin is not merely cosmetic colouring. It is a biological pigment with protective functions, and in the eye it helps absorb light, reducing scatter and contributing to the familiar dark brown appearance seen across much of humanity. The iris is not a painted surface but a structure, and what people perceive as colour depends on both pigment and the way light is scattered through tissue. Brown eyes contain more melanin. Blue eyes, when they eventually appear, do not contain blue pigment in the ordinary sense. They reflect a different optical outcome. But that later story matters only because the earlier condition is so stable. When the first modern humans begin leaving Africa in repeated movements over tens of thousands of years, they do not carry an equal palette of eye colours into the wider world. What survives in the genetic and comparative record suggests that these populations are overwhelmingly brown-eyed. This fits not only with modern global distribution, but with the broader pattern of pigmentation traits in ancestral populations. Scholars still debate details of timing, local variation, and how quickly certain visible traits begin changing after dispersal. But the evidence remains strongest for dark eyes as the long-standing human default. If one could stand at a vantage point across the late Pleistocene and watch the movement of human groups from northeast Africa into the Levant, through Arabia, into South Asia, across Eurasia, and eventually into further corners of the world, the faces would vary in many subtle ways, yet the eyes, in colour at least, would mostly remain within the darker ancestral range. That matters because it reminds us how recent blue eyes really are. Not recent in everyday terms, certainly not recent in the lifespan of civilizations, but recent in the lifespan of the species. Homo sapiens as a form is vastly older than the blue-eye mutation associated with many people today. Countless generations live and die before this variation appears. Entire cultural worlds of stone tools, coastal migrations, seasonal camps, cave art, ritual burial, long-distance exchange. An adaptation to harsh climates unfold without it. Human beings cross mountain corridors and river plains. They survive cold snaps and warming periods. They encounter other hominin populations, including Neanderthals, and absorb traces of them into their ancestry. They spread into environments their African ancestors never knew. Through all of this, the eye remains, in its visible colour, largely conservative. It is easy to overlook just how remarkable that conservatism is. Human beings are restless, inventive, and mobile. But evolution does not remake every trait at the same speed. Some features remain stable for immense periods because they are functional, because mutation does not favour alternatives, or simply because chance has not yet opened the necessary door. Eye colour belongs partly to that category. It is visible, yes, but visibility alone does not guarantee rapid diversification. The human body carries many latent possibilities, but most do not become common unless populations pass through a specific combination of mutation, inheritance, isolation, survival, and often sheer accident. In the long age before blue eyes, no such chain has yet succeeded. Brown-eyed humanity carries the world, and it carries it through severe conditions. The period leading into the eventual appearance of blue eyes is not a calm background. Much of Eurasia is shaped by climatic instability. Ice sheets advance and retreat. Sea levels fall and rise. Habitable zones shift. Grasslands open, contract, and reappear. River systems move across exposed continental shelves. Coastlines familiar to no modern people become migration routes, then disappear underwater. Human groups respond constantly. Some grow isolated, others reconnect, some vanish. In such an environment, traits do not spread merely because they exist. They spread because the people carrying them remain alive long enough, numerous enough, and connected enough to pass them on. Before the blue-eye mutation enters the story, brown eyes have already endured this test over and over again. The dominance of dark eyes also helps explain why the arrival of blue would later stand out so strongly. Novelty requires a background. If a community has known only one broad range of appearance for generations beyond memory, then deviation can become socially visible even when it has no obvious practical meaning. Ancient people do not need modern genetics to notice patterns of resemblance. They know which children resemble which parents. They know when siblings differ. They notice when an infant carries some surprising feature. No single explanation fully accounts for how prehistoric communities interpreted such differences, because the evidence does not preserve those reactions. But what survives in the record suggests that humans, like humans everywhere, are attentive observers of one another. Before blue eyes can become common, they must first be noticed against a world in which brown is expected. To understand why brown is expected, it helps to look more closely at what eye colour actually is. The everyday language of colour can mislead. People speak as though the iris is simply dyed, as though brown eyes contain brown pigment and blue eyes contain blue pigment in the same straightforward way paint works on a wall. Biology is subtler. In brown eyes, greater melanin content in the front layers of the iris produces the darker appearance. In blue eyes, much less melanin is present there, and light scattering through the iris creates the visual impression of blue. This is one reason blue eyes can appear to shift in tone depending on light, age, and surrounding colour. The eye is not manufacturing blue in the way a feather or mineral might. It is revealing what happens when pigment is reduced and structure takes over. But again, that only becomes relevant once some genetic pathway begins lowering melanin in the iris. For most of early human history, it does not. There is a broader lesson here about the human tendency to mistake the familiar for the original. Modern populations, especially in Europe and regions shaped by European migration, can give the impression that lighter eyes belong naturally to the old human landscape, yet on a species-wide scale, they do not. Brown eyes remain the global majority today, and they almost certainly represent the overwhelming majority across the deep past. The ancient human face is therefore not best imagined as gradually whitening into variety from the beginning, but as diversifying later and unevenly from a darker ancestral foundation. This is important because modern visual assumptions often run backward into prehistory. People project current distributions into ancient populations as if the past were merely an early version of the present. Ancient DNA has repeatedly shown how misleading that can be. Faces in the past do not align neatly with later expectations. The evidence remains incomplete, but again and again it points toward a human history that is more fluid, more mixed, and more surprising than inherited stereotypes allow. It also points toward an important emotional reality. Brown eyes are not just the baseline in a technical sense. They are the eyes through which most of human prehistory is lived. The eyes that watch firelight against cave walls. The eyes that scan the horizon for herds. The eyes that look down into infants wrapped in hide or woven fibre. The eyes that track weather, recognize kin, and search for water. The eyes that witness the death of companions, the crossing of rivers, the arrival of strangers, the thaw of a season, the first shoots after a hard winter. For tens of thousands of years, the human world is mostly seen through brown eyes, and the human face is mostly known with them. That immense continuity gives the eventual blue-eye mutation its true scale. It is not just another shade entering a balanced palette, it is a late deviation from a very old norm. And yet the groundwork for deviation is already being laid long before anyone could detect it. As human groups move into new latitudes and environments, as populations narrow and expand, as isolation preserves some lineages while erasing others, the stage is set for rare mutations to matter more than they would in larger, more connected populations. This is one of the strange features of prehistory. Great environmental forces and tiny biological events keep crossing paths. A glacier withdraws. A coastline opens. A group settles for a few generations in relative isolation. A child is born with some new genetic variation. Most such variations disappear. A few do not. The origin of blue eyes will emerge from that intersection, where big history and intimate inheritance meet. Before that point, however, there is only the long continuity of the ancestral state. Brown eyes move with modern humans into Europe, into Western and Central Asia, into the lands that will one day host the first communities known to carry the mutation that changes the iris. Those first settlers do not know they're standing on the threshold of a future visible trait. They know only the terms of their own lives, the pull of seasons, the danger of scarcity, the habits of animals, the bonds of family, the memory of roots. Their children resemble them closely enough. The world is already hard enough without imagining new kinds of appearance. But evolution does not ask for permission, and inheritance is always working below the surface of the familiar. So before blue eyes, there is not emptiness but abundance, an older, darker human continuity stretching across continents and climates, strong enough to remain dominant through most of our species' existence. The mutation that interrupts it will matter precisely because it is so rare at first. because it arrives into a long-established pattern rather than an open field of equal possibilities. It will not create a new humanity. It will alter one visible detail inside the old one. But that is often how the deepest changes begin, not by replacing the whole, but by entering it quietly and staying. Somewhere in that continuity, in a population already carrying the long inheritance of dark eyes, the crucial alteration finally appears, not as a new species, not as a dramatic transformation of the face overnight, but as a small shift in the machinery that regulates pigment itself. And once that happens, the story narrows from humanity in general to one ancestor in particular, a single prehistoric body in which an ancient genetic accident begins to cast its very long shadow. It is one of the most intimate and unsettling ideas in human genetics that a trait now shared by millions may lead back, not merely to a broad region or a long period, but to one ancestral mutation in one person. Strip away the noise of later history, and the origin of blue eyes becomes almost unbearably small. Not a tribe, not a nation, not a people with a name, a single human being, somewhere in the prehistoric north or northeast of the broader European world, carrying a change in DNA that does not remake the body, does not alter the bones, does not create a new category of person, but quietly changes the chemistry of appearance. What passes through that person is not destiny in any mystical sense. It is a mutation, probably ordinary in the way mutations often are at the moment they occur unnoticed, unintended, without inherent meaning. Only later, when it survives against the odds, does it begin to look extraordinary. Modern genetic research has narrowed this story with unusual boldness. The common blue eye trait found across many living populations appears strongly associated with the genetic variation affecting the OCA2 and HERC2 region, a regulatory area that influences melanin production in the iris. Put more simply, the mutation does not insert blue pigment into the eye. It changes the regulation of how much brown pigment develops there. When melanin in the front of the iris is reduced, light scatters differently, and the eye appears blue. That may sound almost anticlimactic, but in biology, anticlimax is often the point. Large visual consequences can emerge from modest shifts in regulation. The evidence suggests that many blue-eyed people share this same ancestral regulatory change, which is why scientists sometimes describe blue eyes as tracing back to a genetic founder event. Scholars still debate the finer details of how many related variants were involved and exactly how the trait first looked in living individuals, but what survives in the record suggests a surprisingly tight bottleneck in origin. This does not mean that every light eye colour on Earth reduces neatly to one event, or that the genetics of appearance can be compressed into a single switch. Biology resists neat storytelling. Eye colour today depends on several genes interacting, and the blue eye mutation associated with this shared origin works inside a larger pigmentation system. Even so, the central point remains striking. Somewhere between the great population movements of late prehistory and the later reshaping of Europe by farmers and steppe herders, one mutation emerges and survives. That survival is the truly improbable part. Mutations occur constantly. Most vanish. A genetic change in one person will disappear entirely unless that person has descendants, unless some of these descendants also survive and reproduce, unless the line is not extinguished by hunger, illness, accident, infertility, or simple bad luck, and unless the populations carrying the change are not later swallowed without leaving a trace. The mathematics of ancestry are merciless. To become visible thousands of years later, The mutation must pass through a long corridor of survival events so narrow that hindsight makes it look almost miraculous. Imagine that first carrier, though imagination must remain disciplined here. Science can identify pathways, but it cannot reconstruct the personality of the individual at the center of the event. We do not know the sex of that person, or the exact place, or the social role, or whether the mutation appeared in a child who lived to adulthood, or in a parent whose line had already begun. We do not know whether the eyes look clearly blue in the way modern observers would expect, or whether the earliest expression was subtler, perhaps greyish or variable depending on surrounding genetics. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the mutation's first visible effect in a living face. But it is reasonable to imagine a community small enough that unusual appearance could be noticed. A child grows. The face changes with age. Family members look, perhaps with curiosity, perhaps with indifference. Life continues under the old pressures: weather, prey, disease, kinship, movement. The mutation does not exempt its carrier from any of that. That last point matters because modern people are tempted to romanticize visible traits. Blue eyes, viewed through later centuries of poetry, portraiture, and fantasy, accumulate an aura they did not possess at the beginning. In prehistory, a new eye color is not a symbol. It is simply a feature, and whether that feature matters socially depends on circumstances now lost. Perhaps it is striking in a way that subtly affects mate choice. Perhaps it means nothing at all besides skill, health, kin ties, or group alliances. Perhaps in one band it is seen as unusual and memorable, while in another it is barely remarked upon. Ancient people are not modern magazines searching for novelty in faces. They live close to necessity. At the same time, humans are never blind to appearance. Recognition, attraction, familiarity, and difference all operate in even the harshest worlds. The early fate of blue eyes may therefore have depended on a mixture of chance and perception, so complex that it can never be fully untangled. What can be said with more confidence is that the mutation arises in a world already shaped by population thinning and local isolation. That makes founder effects and genetic drift especially important. In large, dense, highly connected populations, rare mutations can easily be diluted or lost. In smaller populations, especially those that remain somewhat isolated or pass through bottlenecks, chance can amplify unusual traits. A family line carrying the mutation may survive not because the trait is strongly adaptive, but because the group itself persists and expands. This is one of the quiet ironies of human evolution. Traits later treated as meaningful may have survived for reasons that are brutally indifferent to meaning. A flood misses one camp. A disease spares one lineage. A migration route opens for one community and closes for another. A handful of descendants endure. From such accidents, visible inheritance can grow. The mutation itself likely concerns gene regulation rather than the direct coding of pigment proteins. That distinction is easy to miss, but it helps explain why the story of blue eyes is often misunderstood. People sometimes search for a mythical blue eye gene, as though one isolated unit of heredity simply stamps an iris with color. The reality is more intricate. Regulatory DNA can influence when, where, and how strongly other genes are expressed. In this case, the relevant change appears to reduce the activity associated with brown pigmentation in the iris, allowing the physical structure of the eye to scatter light in a way that reads as blue. This is less like painting over the eye, and more like lowering a curtain that once darkened it. The result is visually dramatic, but the underlying mechanism is subtle. That subtlety is one reason the mutation could pass unnoticed in every way except appearance. There is also something revealing in the likely fragility of the first generations who carried it. The common fantasy is that once a trait appears, it moves forward cleanly. But inheritance in small prehistoric groups is irregular. A carrier may have only one surviving child. That child may not inherit the variant. Another carrier may pass it on, but only through daughters, or only through sons who die young, or through grandchildren born into another group entirely. The line can narrow almost to extinction, and then widen again. What survives in the genetic pattern suggests not a straight march toward prevalence, but a long, contingent persistence. The mutation is born vulnerable. It has no guarantee of future success. It must live through centuries or millennia of obscurity before later demographic changes allow it to become common in certain regions. This is where the story grows more human, not less scientific. Every shared mutation is also a monument to forgotten ancestors, not because those ancestors were special in the grand historical sense, but because they were ordinary enough to live, love, reproduce, and remain within the chain of descent. The first carrier of the blue-eye mutation disappears completely as an individual. No grave can be securely named. No object can be tied with certainty to that body. No oral history survives. And yet something from that person continues more effectively than memory ever could. It continues in faces. It continues every time an iris catches pale daylight and reveals that old reduction of pigment. There is a strange humility in that. Human beings spend vast effort trying to preserve names, monuments, reputations, and bloodlines. Most fail. A prehistoric mutation succeeds where almost everything else vanishes. Still, caution remains necessary. The shared origin of the common blue-eye trait does not mean that all blue-eyed individuals are close relatives in any meaningful social sense, nor does it support later fantasies of purity or singular descent. Given enough generations, ancestry expands explosively. If one goes back thousands of years, nearly everyone with surviving descendants becomes an ancestor of enormous numbers of people. The significance of the mutation lies not in exclusivity, but in the proof that visible human variation can emerge from surprisingly narrow beginnings and then dissolve into wider populations through repeated mixing. Blue eyes do not mark a separate people. They mark a successful variant moving through many peoples. That distinction will become crucial later. When modern ideologies try to turn an ancient genetic accident into a badge of identity, it was never designed to bear. There is also the question of when exactly this mutation appears. Estimates have shifted over time as genetic methods improve, but many discussions place its origin somewhere in the range of roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, though uncertainty remains. That window matters because it situates the mutation in a world already changing fast. The Great Ice Age has ended. Northern Europe is transforming. Forests spread. Coastlines redraw themselves. Human populations are becoming more regionally structured, and in some areas new lifeways are on the horizon. If the estimate is broadly correct, then the first carrier does not live in the primordial dawn of humanity, but in a later prehistoric landscape where ecology, migration, and population density are creating new possibilities for rare traits to persist. What survives in the record suggests a period of transition rather than stasis. That may be one reason the mutation endures. It enters a world in motion, and motion is everything. A mutation cannot matter unless people move, mix, or remain isolated in just the right ways. The first blue-eyed ancestor may live near the Baltic margins, in southern Scandinavia, around the Black Sea, or somewhere in adjacent zones of post-glacial Eurasia. Different models and earlier studies have pointed in different directions, and scholars still debate the exact homeland. The geography remains less certain than the genetic logic. Somewhere within that broader northern belt, an ancestral population carries the mutation long enough for it to stabilize and spread. The map is blurred, but the principle is clear. A local event begins a continental story. In that sense, the origin of blue eyes resembles many turning points in human history that are invisible when they happen. No one at the beginning knows it is a beginning. The first farmer does not know a world of fields is opening. The first metal worker does not know stone is slowly losing its monopoly. The first sailor on a new route does not know maps are changing. Likewise, the first carrier of the blue-eye mutation does not know that a detail of the face has entered the human future. That ignorance is part of what makes the story so haunting. Change begins quietly. It is recognized only later, once it has already happened. But a mutation, no matter how persistent, needs a world that can carry it. Genes do not move themselves across landscapes. People do. And the world into which this ancient variation emerges is not gentle. It is a place of glacial memory, harsh light, expanding forests, icy waters, and migrations unfolding beneath pale northern skies. To understand why the mutation survived there at all, the lens has to widen again, from one ancestor to the difficult lands and changing climates that shape the people who inherited it. The world that receives the blue-eye mutation is not stable ground. It is the aftermath of ice, a continent still remembering cold even as the glaciers loosen their grip. For thousands of years, enormous sheets of ice have dominated the north, pressing down landscapes, redirecting rivers, scraping bedrock, and forcing life into corridors of survival. Then, slowly and unevenly, the ice begins to retreat. What it leaves behind is not a gentle paradise waiting for settlement, but a raw and changing world. Lakes gather in glacial scars, new coastlines appear, then shift again as sea levels rise. Tundra gives way to scrub to woodland, woodland in some places to thickening forest. Animals move, plants move, human beings move with them, following opportunity into lands that had once been uninhabitable or barely accessible. This is the ecological stage on which the early carriers of blue eyes likely live, a world defined not by permanence, but by transition. That transition matters because traits spread differently in unstable landscapes. A rare mutation cannot become common by magic. It needs people clustered in ways that allow inheritance to accumulate, and it needs movement or isolation to work in its favor. Post-glacial Eurasia provides both. In some regions, small human groups are scattered across vast territory, separated by forests, wetlands, rivers, and coasts that are as much barriers as pathways. In others, seasonal routes create repeated contact. A shoreline rich in fish and marine mammals can support communities that endure longer than inland camps. A river corridor can tie distant groups together. A peninsula can preserve certain lineages through partial isolation. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly where the common blue-eye mutation first settles into a lasting population, but what survives in the record suggests an ancient geography full of demographic pockets, places where chance could hold on longer than usual. These landscapes are also marked by unusual light. Northern latitudes compress and stretch the day in ways unfamiliar to equatorial ancestors. Winters narrow the sun to a weak arc close to the horizon. Summers broaden it into long evenings, and, farther north, lingering twilight that hardly seems to end. Snow, ice, water, and pale sky alter how light meets the eye. It is tempting to turn that immediately into a neat adaptive story, as though blue eyes must have emerged because dimmer environments somehow favoured them. Popular explanations often move in that direction, yet scholars still debate the relevance of light environment, and no single explanation fully accounts for the rise of blue eyes as a straightforward adaptation to northern climate. The mutation most likely survives not because it grants some overwhelming visual advantage, but because it passes through populations whose size and structure allow it to persist. Still, the northern light matters in another sense. It becomes part of the emotional and visual world in which the trait is later noticed, remembered, and perhaps selected. To imagine that world properly, it helps to leave behind the tidy colours of museum dioramas and think instead in textures: wet bark, cold wind, reeds moving at lake edges, mud underfoot in thawing seasons, driftwood on raw coasts, the smell of fish oil, smoke, damp hides, and marrow fat. Birch and pine beginning to reclaim land once locked under ice. Long stretches of silence broken by bird calls, cracking frost, and the low practical sounds of people working to remain alive. Human groups in these environments are not abstract prehistoric populations. They are families and bands negotiating hunger, childbirth, infection, social tension, and the timing of movement. The children who inherit the mutation do so in camps where every extra mouth matters and every winter makes its own demands. The eye colour itself may be striking, but striking features do not feed people. Survival remains the older law, and yet survival is never just physical. People must also form bonds, choose partners, recognise outsiders, and negotiate status within small communities. In such contexts, appearance may matter in subtle ways even when no one articulates it as a theory. The face is always social. An unusual eye colour in a world of mostly dark irises might catch attention not as a symbol, but as a memorable detail attached to a person known for other reasons. Perhaps a child with lighter eyes also comes from a successful family line, or from a household linked to seasonal abundance along a rich shoreline. Perhaps the trait appears in a group already experiencing some degree of isolation, where repeated marriages among related or neighbouring families keep it circulating. The evidence cannot reconstruct those intimate choices, but what survives in the broader demographic pattern suggests that blue eyes do not spread through vast anonymous populations at first. They move through people who know one another by face. The climate of this era adds another layer of uncertainty. Even after the major glacial retreat, the early Holocene and adjacent late glacial world do not settle instantly into a single stable pattern. There are abrupt fluctuations, regional differences, warming pulses, cooling episodes, and shifting ecologies that can make one generation's hunting ground unreliable in the next. A coastline used by grandparents may be altered by rising water before grandchildren inherit it. Forests can close over open land, changing prey species and travel routes. Some communities adapt by becoming more specialized fishers or foragers. Others move, others disappear. Rare traits carried in small populations are therefore always at risk. That the blue eye mutation survives through such conditions is a reminder that ancient lineages persist, not because history is smooth, but because some manage to remain intact through instability. This is also the period in which the North ceases to be merely a margin. As ice withdraws and environments become more habitable, regions around the Baltic, the North Sea Basin, and other northern zones begin to host more continuous human presence. Some of these landscapes are now gone, drowned beneath modern waters. The land once connecting Britain more broadly to the continent, for example, includes expanses later swallowed by rising seas. Other coastal shells that once served as migration routes or resource zones now lie underwater, erased from ordinary sight. That means part of the story may be happening in places no longer visible on modern maps. Ancient families carrying the mutation may have lived along drowned shorelines, walked across plains that are now seabed, or buried their dead in ground long since claimed by the sea. This is one of the most haunting aspects of post-glacial prehistory. The geography itself has become fragmentary. Some of the crucial stages in human appearance may have unfolded in landscapes we can no longer easily study. The northern world also preserves a paradox. It is harsh, yet it can produce strong local continuity, rich aquatic environments, seasonal predictability in some resources, and repeated occupation of favoured sites can anchor small groups for generations. This is important because continuity is what rare mutations need. A trait can remain invisible in global terms yet survive locally if the community carrying it is stable enough. One camp returns to the same lake. One cluster of families occupies the same coastal inlets. One network of exchange persists between neighbouring groups. Over time, what was once an accident in one body becomes a familiar inheritance in a local population. It may still be rare by broader standards, but it is no longer a single event. It has become a lineage. Some researchers and commentators have tried to explain the eventual prominence of blue eyes through vitamin D, sunlight, or broader depigmentation trends associated with northern latitudes. Those theories intersect with real questions about skin pigmentation and environmental adaptation. But eye colour is not identical to skin colour, and the pathways do not always move together in simple ways. Ancient DNA has shown again and again that traits modern people assume belong together were once combined differently. So while the northern setting encourages speculation about adaptation, caution is necessary. Blue eyes likely survive first through demography and inheritance more than through clear functional superiority. The ancient landscapes of the north do not select traits with perfect logic. They preserve whatever their human carriers manage to carry forward. That makes the visual atmosphere of the region all the more striking. Pale winter daylight on skin darkened by weather and work. Firelight reflecting in eyes at close range inside hide shelters or timbered dwellings. Spring melt water flashing under low sun. Fog over lakes. The first silver glimmer of dawn over a cold coast. In these settings, lighter eyes may have appeared unusually vivid, not magical, not marked by destiny, but visually distinct in ways ancient people could not fail to notice. It is possible that such visibility later fed into mate preferences, into social memorability, or into the mere fact that difference is easier to preserve when it is consistently recognized. Scholars still debate how much sexual selection contributed, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the landscapes themselves help explain why the trait would feel noticeable once it existed. There is another deeper reason the post-glacial north matters. It is a zone of human recomposition. People are not simply spreading into empty space. They are sorting into new patterns after millennia of climatic pressure. Some lineages expand into fresh territory. Others contract into refuges. Some groups who have lived through glacial extremes now occupy regions opening wider for longer habitation. This reshuffling creates opportunities for founder effects. A handful of families can come to represent a disproportionate share of future ancestry in a region. If one of those families carries a rare trait, the trait may rise not because it is favoured, but because history temporarily magnifies the descendants of the few. The origin of blue eyes likely belongs to that kind of magnification, where a tiny event is amplified by a continent reorganizing itself after ice. So the northern skies are part of the story, but not in the simplistic sense of destiny written in climate. They matter because they belong to a larger post-glacial theatre in which rare lineages can survive. Local populations can stabilize, and visible variation can begin to accumulate in ways impossible under older conditions. The mutation enters a human world that is cold, mobile, fragmented, and full of new ecological openings. It is exactly the sort of world where a small inherited difference might either vanish forever or endure long enough to become part of regional identity without anyone yet understanding what is happening. And still, for some time, blue eyes remain vulnerable. A mutation may be born in one ancestor and preserved by a landscape, but it cannot spread far unless families continue carrying it through the old, fragile chain of births, alliances, and kinship. That next stage is even more delicate than climate. Before blue eyes become a wider regional trait, they must survive in households, in siblings, in cousins, in small communities where inheritance is not a statistic but a matter of who lives, who leaves, and who remains. Long before blue eyes become a recognizable feature of wider populations, they exist in a much smaller and more fragile world, the world of family. Not regions, not nations, not maps shaded by percentages, but kin groups gathered around the daily labor of staying alive. This is where most ancient inheritance either survives or disappears. A mutation may arise in one person, but it cannot become history until it enters the intimate arithmetic of parents and children, siblings and cousins, marriages and deaths. That arithmetic is never generous. In prehistoric communities, survival to adulthood is uncertain. Infant mortality is high, accidents are common, and every generation is exposed to hunger, cold, disease, and simple bad luck. A rare trait has no privilege in such a setting. It must endure as every lineage endures, through bodies that remain alive long enough to pass it on. That makes the early spread of blue eyes less dramatic than people often imagine. There's no sudden transformation of a landscape from dark-eyed to light-eyed populations. The first generations carrying the mutation are likely scattered, local, and easily lost. A child inherits the variant, but perhaps dies before having children. Another survives and passes it to only one descendant. In one family, it disappears within 2 generations. In another, it lingers at low frequency, surfacing unpredictably depending on how the relevant genes combine. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how the trait first expressed itself in these earliest lineages, and scholars still debate the pace at which it became visually common enough to matter at a population level. But what survives in the logic of population genetics suggests a long period in which blue eyes are less a widespread feature than a family inheritance, moving quietly through small circles of related people. That quiet movement is one of the most human parts of the story. It asks us to imagine ancient communities not as broad anonymous populations, but as places where faces are familiar and genealogy, even if not formally recorded, is lived knowledge. People know who belongs to whom. They know which child resembles a mother's family, which boy has his grandfather's brow, which girl carries some trait not seen in her siblings. In small-scale societies, memory of resemblance can matter more than any abstract category. So if blue eyes begin appearing in a particular lineage, they may become associated, however loosely, with that house, that camp cluster, that local family reputation. Ancient people do not need genetics to recognize recurrence. They simply need time, observation, and continuity. Continuity, however, is exactly what prehistory makes difficult. Families move, camps break apart, mates are exchanged between groups. A drought or bad season can scatter people who had once stayed near each other. Inheritance, therefore, travels along shifting human routes. A daughter carrying the mutation may marry into a neighbouring band. A son may leave his birthplace and raise children on another coast or inland route. Orphaned children may be absorbed into other households. Social bonds, not just biological laws, determine how a trait moves. No single explanation fully accounts for the survival of blue eyes in these early stages, because the mutation's fate depends on dozens of decisions and contingencies that leave no clean record. Yet what survives in the broader pattern suggests that the line does not remain trapped in one tiny pocket forever. It begins to move because people move, and because families are never closed systems. There is also the strange role of rarity itself. A feature that is too rare can vanish without a trace. But a feature that remains rare while becoming visible may acquire social presence. That does not mean prestige in any modern sense, and caution is essential here. It would be easy to smuggle later ideas of beauty backward into the prehistoric world and assume that blue eyes must immediately have attracted attention in ways that favoured reproduction. Scholars still debate whether sexual selection played a major role, and the evidence remains incomplete. Still, rarity can be memorable. In a small community, the uncommon face is often the face easiest to remember. It may become personally distinctive in ways that affect courtship, alliance, or simple recognition, even if no one treats it as special in principle. Human beings respond to difference, sometimes consciously, often not. The earliest blue eyes may have benefited not from any universal preference, but from the subtle social power of being noticed. Chance remains the harsher force. In a world of small populations, genetic drift can do more than intention ever could. Traits rise and fall because lineages happen to expand or contract. One family may enjoy several generations of relative stability on a productive shoreline, with enough food and enough social connection to sustain a growing set of descendants. Another may be broken by repeated losses. If the mutation is concentrated in the first family, it persists. If in the second, it disappears. From the outside, centuries later, the result can look meaningful. From the inside, it may have depended on weather, pathogens, resource access, and the random distribution of births. This is one reason the early history of blue eyes resists romantic interpretation. It is not the smooth triumph of a striking trait. It is the uneven endurance of a vulnerable one. The household setting also reminds us that blue eyes are never acting alone. Even in these early lineages, the mutation exists within whole people whose health, attractiveness, fertility, status, and survival depend on many other traits. An unusual iris does not matter much if its carrier is chronically ill, socially marginal, or killed young. Likewise, a family line can spread rapidly for reasons entirely unrelated to eye colour. Good ecological position, hunting skill, social alliances, knowledge of a migratory route, success in fishing, access to raw materials, or sheer resilience during a hard climatic fluctuation can all enlarge one lineage's future footprint. The blue eye mutation may ride forward on those broader successes. In that sense, it behaves less like a driver than like a passenger. It survives because people survive. This makes the family history of blue eyes inseparable from the deep emotional realities of prehistoric life. Every visible inheritance is built from countless moments that never enter the record. A mother washing a child in cold water, a father scanning the face of an infant to see who it resembles, siblings growing side by side and diverging in small ways, grandparents carrying old memories of which traits belong to which branch of kin. The mutation that will later seem important on a continental scale is At first, folded into these private settings, it is not yet the origin of blue eyes to anyone. It is simply part of this child, this family, this cluster of lives trying to endure another winter. Some lesser-known implications follow from that. In very small populations, unusual traits can become locally concentrated far earlier than they become broadly common. A traveller moving between neighbouring groups might notice that one camp seems to produce more light-eyed children than another, not because the region as a whole has changed, but because family structure has temporarily clustered the mutation there. Such concentrations can exaggerate the appearance of significance. A trait may seem to belong to a local people when in reality it belongs to one or two successful lineages within them. What survives in the record suggests that prehistoric appearance likely varied in patches, not broad uniform zones, especially before later migrations and mixing spread traits more widely. This patchiness is easy to miss because modern maps smooth ancient complexity into clean regional patterns. Patchiness also means that blue eyes could persist for a long time without becoming dominant anywhere. The trait can remain rare across a broad landscape while still surviving continuously in multiple connected kin networks. That is enough. Evolution does not require rapid prevalence. It requires continuity. A lineage held at low frequency for centuries can later expand dramatically if demographic conditions change. The family stage of the story is therefore not merely a prelude. It is the essential reservoir from which later spread becomes possible. Without these modest chains of inheritance, there is no later history to tell. There may also have been moments when the mutation nearly disappeared. This is impossible to document directly, but highly plausible. Ancient populations often pass through bottlenecks, and lineages that later seem foundational may once have hung by a thread. A disease season, a failed hunt, a violent conflict, or a migration gone wrong could have reduced the number of carriers to almost nothing. What survives in the record suggests success, but success in ancestry often conceals repeated brushes with extinction. That fragility gives the story its strange emotional weight. Millions of modern eyes may depend on a prehistory full of near losses. Family, then, is not a sentimental frame here. It is the actual engine of the mutation's survival. Before there are larger explanations involving migration, selection, or regional demographics, there are only people inheriting something unusual and not losing it. Mothers pass it to children. Children grow and carry it outward through marriage and movement. Cousins multiply. Some lines fail. Others continue. The trait remains embedded in relationships, not abstractions. Its earliest geography is probably drawn less by borders than by kinship webs extending along coasts, rivers, forests, and seasonal routes. And those roots matter more with every passing generation. A mutation can survive inside families, but if it is to move beyond a local inheritance, those families must eventually be carried into the wider churn of prehistoric mobility. The same Europe that offers pockets of isolation also offers corridors of movement, and as ancient people travel, exchange, and settle new ground, the rare trait begins to leave the narrow shelter of one lineage and enter the broader story of a changing continent. The continent does not hold still long enough for any rare trait to remain purely local forever. Europe after the Ice Age is a place of movement, not in the dramatic modern sense of borders opening and closing, but in the older human sense of paths worn by repetition. Coastlines followed season after season, rivers used as memory lines through forest and marsh, and landscapes gradually repopulated as climate allows. Families carrying the blue eye mutation do not stay sealed inside a single cradle of origin. They move because all prehistoric people move. Some shift only a little, returning to familiar fishing grounds, lake shores, or hunting zones. Others drift farther, following ecological change, marriage ties, or opportunity. Over time, what began as a mutation inside one ancestry line starts entering the wider demographic fabric of Eurasia, not through a single migration wave, but through countless small acts of human relocation. This is where the story grows larger without losing its uncertainty. Scientists can identify broad patterns of ancient movement, but the exact routes by which the blue eye mutation spreads remain partly obscured. Scholars still debate the timing of its early expansion, the population contexts in which it became more common, and the degree to which it travelled with specific hunter-gatherer groups before later farming societies and steppe populations transformed the genetic landscape again. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because many ancient routes ran through areas that are now submerged, eroded, or only sparsely sampled through archaeology. Still, what survives in the genetic record suggests that movement across post-glacial Europe is fundamental. A rare mutation cannot become regionally visible unless people themselves remain connected, and Europe in this period is a continent of intermittent but real human connection. The map of that connection is not the map modern people inherit from states or empires. It is a map of watersheds, shorelines, forests, islands, and resource zones. The Baltic world matters. So do the North Sea margins, the river corridors of Central and Eastern Europe, and the broad northern belt where human groups, though often small, are not necessarily isolated beyond all contact. Exchange happens. Mates are found beyond the immediate household. Technologies, raw materials, and ideas move. Sometimes slowly, sometimes unexpectedly far. A decorative object, a worked stone, a style of tool, or a burial practice can reveal networks stretching beyond one local camp. Genes travel along those same human ties. The blue eye mutation does not need an empire to spread. It only needs repeated contact, reproduction, and time. Time is the crucial part. Modern imagination often expects visible change to happen in sweeping bursts. Ancient demography usually works more patiently. The mutation likely remains patchy for long periods, more common in some lineages and regions than others. A valley may host several related families carrying it, while the next watershed remains mostly dark-eyed. One coastal population may preserve it through continuity, while an inland group loses it entirely, over generations. These patches overlap, dissolve, and reform as people shift. This is one reason no single explanation fully accounts for the early distribution of blue eyes. The trait is shaped by local history as much as by any grand continental process. Migration spreads possibility, but local survival determines outcome. There is also the matter of scale. A migration does not have to involve huge numbers to matter genetically. A few families entering a new region, then leaving many descendants, can change the future appearance of that area far more than a larger movement that leaves little surviving ancestry. Prehistory is full of such disproportion. What matters is not merely who arrives, but who remains in the line of descent. A carrier of the blue eye mutation may move into a neighbouring population where the trait is absent, marry there, and leave enough descendants that the variant becomes established in that community. That establishment may still be modest at first, but once rooted in more than one local population, the mutation becomes harder to erase entirely. It begins to occupy several branches of the human tree at once. The movement of hunter-gatherer groups across Europe after the glacial retreat provides one plausible framework for this process. These communities are often mobile, but mobility does not mean chaos. It usually follows ecological logic. Fish runs, seasonal game, plant gathering cycles, water access, and shelter possibilities all shape routes. Some groups become strongly associated with particular territories and return to them repeatedly. Others interact at seasonal aggregation sites where marriages, exchanges, and social ties may be renewed. In such settings, rare traits can move farther than a simple image of isolated bands would suggest. A person does not need to cross a whole continent alone for their genus to travel. Over successive generations, marriage networks can carry a mutation great distances without any single dramatic journey. This may help explain why blue eyes, though likely emerging from a narrow ancestral source, do not remain trapped in one tiny enclave. They move through ordinary human processes. A daughter leaves one shoreline for another. A son born inland joins kin closer to a lake district. Cousins spread outward. Family networks overlap with neighboring groups. The mutation travels embedded in lives, not as an abstract biological force. The face becomes the vehicle of deep time. At the same time, movement also creates dilution. Not every migration spreads a trait. Sometimes it weakens it. A carrier entering a much larger population where the variant is rare may leave few descendants, and the mutation may fade into near invisibility for generations. Ancient Europe is therefore not a stage on which blue eyes advance steadily from source to dominance. It is a shifting mosaic in which the variant sometimes expands, sometimes contracts, sometimes vanishes locally, and sometimes reappears through related lines elsewhere. That irregularity matters because it keeps the story honest. We are not watching inevitability, we are watching persistence. There is another complication. Eye colour does not spread in isolation from ancestry more broadly. As populations move and mix, they bring packages of traits, habits, and genes with them. The blue eye mutation may travel alongside distinctive hunter-gatherer ancestry components that later, ancient DNA studies can partially trace. But those ancestry signals themselves are not fixed forever. Later demographic changes will overlay them, especially with the arrival of early farmers from Anatolia and, later still, steppe-associated populations from the Pontic-Caspian grasslands. By the time historical Europe begins to emerge into clearer view, the populations carrying blue eyes are already products of multiple layers of migration and mixing. That means the early movement of the mutation is both real and difficult to isolate. It is part of a larger river of ancestry, not a separate stream. One of the more surprising implications is that blue eyes may have travelled through people who looked, in other respects, quite unlike the later stereotypes attached to Europe. Ancient DNA has forced repeated revisions of what modern observers assume about the prehistoric face. Traits that seem bundled together today were once differently arranged. The evidence remains incomplete, but it strongly suggests that the mutation could move through populations whose skin tone, hair, and overall appearance do not resemble the later imagery of Northern Europeans that modern culture projects backward. This matters because it warns against reading migration as the spread of a ready-made type. What is moving is a genetic variant through human groups whose full appearance is still evolving, and whose ancestry is already mixed in ways that later myths prefer to ignore. Migration also reminds us that landscapes themselves are active participants. Rivers pull people outward, coasts connect communities more efficiently than forests. Islands can isolate but also invite hopping movement if waters are favourable. Mountain barriers slow spread. while open plains ease it. The mutation's early path is therefore geographic as much as genealogical. It follows where people can live, travel, and reproduce. Some corridors amplify it, others swallow it. The ancient map is not coloured by destiny but by opportunity. Over long stretches of time, these movements make the mutation harder to localise and more difficult to erase. Once established across several interconnected populations, blue eyes begin to exist not just as a family trait but as a regional possibility. Still not universal, still far from evenly distributed, but present enough that the face of Europe is slowly becoming more varied than it had once been. That variation does not arrive in a sudden wave. It accumulates through 1,000 forgotten journeys, and yet movement alone may not fully explain why the trait survives so stubbornly and, in some places, seems to rise beyond what chance alone might predict. This is where the story turns more controversial. Once a visible feature exists and becomes memorable, human choice may begin to matter alongside demography. Attraction, novelty, and preference are difficult forces to prove in prehistory, but impossible to dismiss altogether. Somewhere in the slow spread of blue eyes across a changing continent lies the uncomfortable possibility that people noticed the uncommon and sometimes favoured it. At some point, chance alone begins to feel insufficient. A rare mutation can survive through drift, founder effects, and the slow mechanics of family inheritance. But when a visible trait remains persistent and, in certain regions, becomes unexpectedly common, another possibility enters the frame. People may have helped it along, not consciously in the modern sense, not through any formal preference system or articulated theory of beauty, but through attraction, novelty, and the ordinary human tendency to notice what is uncommon. This is where the origin of blue eyes stops being only a story of genes and landscapes and becomes a story of human perception. The idea is controversial, hard to prove, and easy to oversimplify. Scholars still debate it. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet the possibility cannot be dismissed, because human mating is never purely random, and visible traits often acquire social weight, even in societies that leave no written explanation of their desires. The broad concept is known as sexual selection, though the phrase can sound more mechanical than the lives it describes. In simple terms, some traits spread not because they improve survival directly, but because they influence mate choice, a feature that is distinctive, attractive, or memorable may be passed on more often if the people carrying it are chosen slightly more frequently as partners. Over many generations, even small biases can matter. This does not require everyone in a society to agree on beauty, nor does it require the trait to be universally admired. It only requires enough repeated preference, in enough local settings, for the carriers of the trait to have somewhat greater reproductive success than they otherwise would. Blue eyes, because they are immediately visible and initially rare, fit the kind of trait that invites this line of thought. There is a certain intuitive appeal to the theory. In small prehistoric communities where most people have dark eyes, a child or young adult with lighter irises might appear unusually vivid, not necessarily more beautiful in any permanent or objective sense, but distinctive. Distinctiveness can matter. Humans are drawn to contrast, to novelty, to the features that stand out from the expected. In a world where many aspects of life are repetitive, dangerous, and constrained, the uncommon face may exert a subtle pull simply because it is uncommon. That is the core of one influential idea blue eyes could have spread partly because they were rare, and because rarity itself may have made them desirable. Once they became more common, the advantage might diminish. but by then the trait could already be established. Still, attractive theories are not the same as proven ones. One major difficulty is that prehistoric desire leaves almost no direct record. Bones do not reveal mate preference. Stone tools do not preserve standards of beauty. Burial goods can sometimes hint at status, symbolism, or special treatment. But they do not tell us whether unusual eyes were admired, ignored, or regarded with suspicion. No single explanation fully accounts for how early humans responded to visible variation. Modern researchers can infer patterns from genetics, population models, and analogies with known human behavior, but inference is not certainty. This is why the sexual selection hypothesis remains plausible rather than settled. It offers one way to explain the persistence of a conspicuous trait, but it cannot be demonstrated in the same way one can demonstrate a specific mutation or ancestry cluster. There is also a danger in smuggling modern aesthetics backward into the past. Blue eyes today carry centuries of artistic, literary, and cultural baggage in parts of the world shaped by European history. They have been romanticized, fetishized, trivialized, and sometimes endowed with absurd symbolic meaning. None of that tells us how late prehistoric people felt when they encountered a lighter-eyed person in a cold camp beside a lake or under the smoke-dark roof of a timber dwelling. Ancient people did not inherit modern fashion photography, nationalist mythology, or the visual standards of later empires. Their preferences, whatever they were, would have been shaped by local life health, fertility, alliance value, household reputation, skill, kinship, and familiarity. Eye colour, if it mattered, would have mattered within that older social texture, not outside it. Even so, there are reasons to think visible novelty may have had some effect. In many species, including humans, rare traits can enjoy a temporary advantage precisely because they are unusual. Psychologists and biologists studying preference in modern contexts sometimes find that novelty attracts attention more strongly than familiarity, at least under certain conditions. Extrapolating that into prehistory is risky, but not irrational. A distinctive iris may have made a face easier to remember, a person more recognizable across repeated gatherings, or an individual more likely to be discussed within kin networks. In small populations, even a small edge in visibility can have consequences. A person who stands out is more likely to be noticed, and being noticed is often the first step toward preference. There may also have been gendered dimensions, though these are even more speculative. Some popular accounts suggest blue eyes spread more through female choice, others through male choice, and still others through shifting dynamics in post-glacial societies, where sex ratios, mobility, or competition patterns were changing. The evidence for such claims is thin. Scholars still debate whether any specific social arrangement would have amplified a rare visual trait in this way. What survives in the record suggests only that human social life was variable, and that mate choice, where it existed, was likely entangled with many factors beyond appearance. To reduce the spread of blue eyes to a simple prehistoric beauty preference would be misleading, but to exclude attraction entirely would be equally unrealistic. Humans are social and visual animals. Faces matter. Another possibility is that the trait became associated with particular lineages or groups that were successful for reasons unrelated to eye colour, and that apparent preference followed from that association. A family known for good access to resources, strong alliances, or social influence might happen to carry the mutation. In that case, people choosing mates from that family are not choosing blue eyes as such. They're choosing status, security, or connection. and the eye colour travels along with those advantages. Over time, later observers might mistake that pattern for direct preference, when it is actually a side effect of lineage success. This is one reason the story remains so difficult to resolve. Visible traits rarely move through human populations for only one reason. The emotional environment of small societies makes the question even more subtle. Prehistoric marriage and partnering are unlikely to have operated as modern individuals often imagine, with purely personal desire acting in isolation. Kin groups, social norms, reciprocity, territory, and household survival all shape who pairs with whom. A person might prefer one partner but marry another because of alliance or necessity. A rare trait might be admired in private yet ignored in practice, or it might become part of reputation, a feature associated with remembered ancestors or distinctive family branches. The evidence cannot tell us. What it can suggest is that once blue eyes existed and remained visible across generations, they entered a social field where appearance was never irrelevant, even when it was not decisive. Some researchers have proposed that lighter eyes may have signaled youth or helped make emotions easier to read, because the contrast between iris and pupil or surrounding features could appear more pronounced. These ideas remain speculative and, in many cases, weakly supported. It is easy to invent adaptive or social benefits once a trait is common. The harder task is showing that those benefits actually drove early spread. Most likely the truth lies somewhere less dramatic. Blue eyes probably survived first through demography and inheritance, then may have received occasional help from human preference, where the trait was rare enough to be distinctive. That kind of mixed explanation is less satisfying than a single cause, but the past often works that way. There is another reason not to overstate sexual selection. Blue eyes do not become common everywhere. If the trait had possessed some overwhelming universal attractiveness, one might expect a much wider and more uniform spread. Instead, its distribution remains regionally uneven across history and into the present. That unevenness suggests that whatever social advantages the trait sometimes enjoyed were heavily dependent on local population structure, ancestry, and movement, preference. If it mattered, operated inside demographic constraints. It could amplify a trait already present, but it could not conjure it from absence or overcome all other forces. What makes the theory endure, despite all these cautions, is that it fits something recognizably human. People notice each other. They form preferences that are not always rational. They remember unusual faces. They sometimes choose what stands apart from the ordinary, then later forget that it was once unusual at all. Blue eyes may have benefited from that very human pattern, not because prehistoric communities were sentimental about colour, but because novelty has its own quiet power. A trait that catches the eye may be given more chances to remain in the world. But blue eyes do not spread simply because they are seen. They spread because the underlying biology allows them to be inherited, modified, and recombined across generations. The seductive image of one blue-eye gene choosing its path through desire is far too simple. Behind the visible effect lies a more complex machinery of pigmentation, ancestry, and interaction with other traits. To understand why blue eyes could persist in so many forms, and why their story is more tangled than popular myth suggests, the lens has to move beneath appearance itself, into the deeper genetic system that never acts through a single mutation alone. The story becomes less simple the moment one looks beneath the surface of the iris. Popular imagination loves singular causes, one mutation, one trait, one neat explanation. That is understandable. The idea that all blue-eyed people may trace their common trait to one ancient ancestor is already dramatic enough. and it invites a tidy picture of heredity, as though a single switch was flipped in prehistory and the human face followed obediently from there. But genes do not usually behave with such theatrical clarity. Even when one mutation plays a central role, it acts inside a crowded biological system, and that system has been changing for tens of thousands of years. Blue eyes are not the work of one isolated miracle in DNA. They are the visible result of an ancient regulatory change moving through a much larger web of pigmentation genes, ancestry patterns, and population mixing. The closer one gets to the biology, the less the myth of the single blue eye gene can survive. At the center of the best-known explanation is the relationship between the OCA2 and HERC2 regions of the genome. One of them helps regulate pigmentation, and the other contains a variant that can influence how strongly that pigmentation is expressed in the iris. The effect, broadly speaking, is not to create blue pigment, because blue eyes contain no ordinary blue dye waiting to be discovered. Instead, the relevant regulatory change reduces melanin production in the iris. With less pigment in the front layers of the eye, light scatters through the tissue in a way that makes the iris appear blue. That much is now a relatively stable part of the scientific understanding. But it is only the beginning, because reducing melanin in the iris does not automatically determine every shade, every surrounding feature, or every visible combination the trait can produce once it enters real populations. That is where the larger pigmentation system matters. Eye color is polygenic, influenced by more than one gene. So is skin color, so is hair color, and although these traits are related, they are not chained together with perfect consistency. This is one of the reasons the ancient story of blue eyes is so much stranger than later stereotypes suggest. The human body does not evolve in neatly matched sets designed for modern expectations. A mutation affecting iris pigmentation can spread through populations whose skin remains relatively dark by later European standards, whose hair color varies differently, and whose broader appearance reflects ancestry combinations that no modern category captures very well. Scholars still debate the exact interactions among the many genes involved in pigmentation, but what survives in the record suggests a deep and often surprising looseness in how visible traits combine. This matters because modern people often assume that blue eyes must arrive together with pale skin and perhaps lighter hair, as though all these features are simply parts of the same ancient package. They are not. Some share environmental and evolutionary contexts, and some genes influence overlapping pathways, but the timelines differ and the combinations can be unexpected. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet ancient DNA has repeatedly shown that the old human face could contain mixtures that later centuries would find unintuitive. A population can carry the well-known blue eye variant without yet carrying the full set of later depigmentation traits common in parts of Europe today. That fact does more than correct a scientific misunderstanding. It breaks the back of a cultural illusion. It reminds us that the visible face of prehistory is not an early draft of modern racial imagery. It is its own world. Even within blue eyes themselves, variation matters. Not every blue eye looks the same. Some are pale and almost grey. Some are darker, deeper, or edged with green. Some shift in appearance with lighting, age, or surrounding pigmentation. Hazel and green eyes complicate the picture further, because intermediate melanin levels and additional genetic interactions can produce colours that do not fit cleanly into broad categories. The ancient mutation often associated with blue eyes plays an important role, but it does not dictate every final nuance. Once the variant enters diverse populations and interacts with other genes, the visual results become more varied. No single explanation fully accounts for every eye color pattern seen in later humans. because the system itself is layered and responsive to ancestry in complex ways. There is another reason simplicity fails. Inheritance is not always visually obvious from one generation to the next. A trait influenced by multiple genes can remain hidden, softened, or reappear unexpectedly depending on which variants come together in children. This would have mattered in prehistory just as it matters now. A family line carrying the blue-eye-associated mutation might not produce strikingly blue-eyed children in every generation. The expression could be inconsistent, especially in mixed ancestry contexts or when other pigmentation genes pull the visible result in a darker direction. That means ancient people may have experienced the trait not as a perfectly reliable family signature, but as something that surfaced, receded, and resurfaced. Such irregularity would make the early spread of blue eyes more subtle and less linear than a modern simplified narrative suggests. It also helps explain why myth grows so easily around visible traits. When a feature appears vividly in some children, less clearly in others, and unpredictably over time, people search for stories to explain it. Much later, those stories harden into pseudo-history. But the biology itself is ordinary in the deepest sense. It is a matter of inheritance, regulation, recombination, and the statistical noise of populations. Blue eyes are striking to look at. Yet their spread depends on the same old processes that shape countless other human traits. They survive because genes move through families, because populations mix, because rare variants are sometimes preserved, and because no trait is ever carried alone. The wider pigmentation network includes genes such as SLC24A, 5SLC, 45A, 2TYR, and others that influence skin, hair, and eye color in different ways and to different degrees. Some become especially important in later European pigmentation patterns. Their timelines of rise and spread do not perfectly match the story of the main blue-eye mutation. This is crucial. It means that to speak of the origin of blue eyes is not the same thing as speaking of the origin of European appearance, which is a much broader and more tangled process involving repeated migrations and selective pressures. The blue-eye story is one thread, not the whole fabric. Later populations that seem visually coherent are often the end result of distinct traits arriving at different times from different ancestral streams, and then settling into combinations that look natural only in hindsight. That hindsight can be dangerously misleading. Once a combination becomes common in a population, people assume it must always have belonged together. They forget how contingent its assembly was. The ancient blue-eye mutation may be older in some regions than the depigmentation variants that later make lighter skin more common there. A person living thousands of years ago could therefore carry a familiar modern eye color trait inside a facial pattern that modern observers would misread completely if given the chance. What survives in the record suggests exactly this sort of contradiction, and it is one of the reasons ancient DNA has been so disruptive. It keeps proving that the past does not honor modern visual assumptions. At the same time, genetics must be handled with care. There is a temptation, especially in discussions of visible traits, to treat DNA as destiny, as though people are nothing more than the outward expression of ancient molecules, but genes act within bodies, environments, and historical populations. A mutation can open a possibility. It cannot fully script the life lived through it. The carriers of blue-eye-associated variants are not passive vessels of heredity. They are foragers, fishers. Migrants, farmers, herders, parents, children, and strangers to one another. Their faces matter because they reveal something about history. But history itself remains larger than any trait. Still, The trait's larger genetic context helps explain why it could endure through so much change. Because blue eyes are part of a broader pigmentation system, they can pass through populations without requiring all related visible traits to move in lockstep. That flexibility makes them durable. The variant can survive demographic turnover, recombine with different ancestries, and remain visible even as surrounding features shift over time. In other words, blue eyes are not fragile because they are isolated. They are resilient because they are embedded in a system capable of producing variation again and again. This is also why the language of purity is so absurd when applied to such traits. Blue eyes do not testify to untouched descent. They testify to successful mixing, recombination, and survival through changing populations. A trait that depends on regulatory variation and polygenic context is practically a rebuke to simplistic identity myths. It shows that visible appearance is assembled historically, not handed down intact from some imaginary original people. The evidence remains incomplete in places, and scholars still debate many details, but on this broader point the direction is clear. Human faces are records of movement and interaction, not monuments to static categories. And nowhere will that become more obvious than when the bones themselves begin to speak. For centuries the story of blue eyes might have remained trapped in speculation, built from living populations and imperfect inference. Then ancient DNA begins to arrive from graves, teeth, and buried skeletons, and the old assumptions start to crack. Suddenly the question is no longer only how the trait could have spread, but who exactly carried it in the past. The answers turn out to be stranger than almost anyone expected. For a long time, the origin of blue eyes had to be reconstructed indirectly. Researchers compared living populations, mapped frequencies, studied inheritance patterns, and tried to infer ancient history from modern bodies. It was a careful exercise, but also a limited one. The present can hint at the past, yet it can also deceive. Populations move, mix, vanish, and expand. Traits become common in one place for reasons that have little to do with where they first appeared. Modern distributions are like the final pages of a very long book, with most of the earlier chapters torn out. Then, over the last few decades, the torn pages begin to return in fragments. Ancient DNA arrives from bones, teeth, and petrous bones buried in caves, cemeteries, and forgotten landscapes. Suddenly the story is no longer built only from descendants. It can be tested against the dead. That change is difficult to overstate. Ancient DNA has transformed prehistoric studies not by making the past simple, but by making it less obedient to modern expectations. Traits once imagined as naturally belonging together are pulled apart. Populations assumed to be stable turn out to be mixtures. Visible features that modern people take for granted appear in combinations no one predicted. The evidence remains incomplete. Because sampling is uneven, preservation is poor in many regions, and every new genome adds to a story still being revised. Yet what survives in the record has already altered the blue eye question profoundly. Instead of merely asking where blue eyes are common now, researchers can ask which ancient individuals carried variants associated with them, when they lived, and what kind of ancestry they had. This does not solve every mystery, but it changes the scale of certainty. The technical process behind this is slow and delicate. Ancient DNA is fragile. It breaks down over time, is contaminated easily, and often survives only in traces. Researchers must extract it from remains that have endured thousands of years of burial, moisture changes, microbial attack, and human disturbance. Often the best preserved material comes from dense regions of the skull or from teeth. Even then, what is recovered is partial. Scientists compare these fragments against known genetic markers, including variants associated with pigmentation. They do not resurrect eye color the way a photograph captures it. They estimate probability. They identify which alleles were present and build informed reconstructions from that. This means that ancient DNA gives powerful evidence, but not perfect certainty. Scholars still debate interpretation, and no single explanation fully accounts for all regional patterns. Even so, the broad results are startling. One of the earliest shocks is how far modern visual assumptions fail when confronted by ancient genomes. Hunter-gatherers from parts of Europe, especially in the Mesolithic period, appear to have carried the genetic variant associated with blue eyes at notable frequencies, even when other pigmentation markers suggest darker skin than later Europeans. That combination is jarring only because modern people have been taught to imagine European-looking features as a package. Ancient DNA tears that package apart. It suggests that some of the people carrying blue eye-associated variants in prehistoric Europe may have looked unlike later populations who also carry the trait. What survives in the record suggests a face unfamiliar to modern stereotypes: dark or darker skin, blue or light eyes, and other features shaped by ancestries no longer visible in their old combinations. This is the kind of evidence that forces history to become stranger and more precise at the same time. It also helps narrow the timing of the trait's rise. By examining ancient genomes across different periods, researchers can track when the blue eye-associated variant appears, where it becomes common, and how it changes as new populations enter Europe. The pattern is not perfectly smooth. Some Mesolithic hunter-gatherer groups show high frequencies. Early farmers entering Europe from Anatolia often seem to carry different pigmentation profiles, including generally darker eyes. Later, steppe-associated populations contribute additional ancestry that reshapes the continent again. Blue eyes do not simply emerge and spread in a straight line. They wax and wane through the meeting of populations. Ancient DNA turns the story from a single origin myth into a demographic drama. A lesser-known but important detail is that ancient DNA sometimes reveals traits in individuals whose archaeological context would not have led anyone to expect them. A burial culture may appear similar across a region, yet the people within it can carry quite different ancestry profiles. Conversely, genetically related populations may leave behind material cultures that vary with environment and local practice. This matters because blue eye-associated variants do not travel attached to pots, tools, or burial styles alone. They travel through people, and people do not always align neatly with the artifacts archaeologists first used to classify them. The evidence remains incomplete, but again and again it suggests caution against overly tidy correlations. A genome can disrupt the whole visual logic of an archaeological culture. There is also a geographical lesson buried in the data. Ancient Europe is not one thing. Northern, Western, Eastern, and Southern regions differ in ancestry composition and in the timing of major demographic shifts. The blue eye-associated variant may have found particularly fertile ground in some hunter-gatherer populations of the north and west, then later interacted with incoming farmers and steppe groups in ways that changed its frequency. In southern Europe, and in many non-European regions, the trait remains much less common. That unevenness becomes easier to explain when the ancient DNA picture is layered rather than flat. Different population histories produce different visible outcomes. What appears natural in one modern region often turns out to be the product of several ancient encounters. Ancient DNA also reminds us that traits do not carry identity by themselves. A skeleton can show ancestry components from several major prehistoric streams. It can also carry pigmentation markers that later ideologies would try to treat as culturally significant, even though they are simply inherited variants. This is perhaps one of the most important contributions of the field. It strips visible traits of the false historical stories later societies drape over them. Blue eyes are no longer easy to imagine as the emblem of some timeless northern race, once the genomes reveal how mixed, recent, and contingent their distribution really is. The dead are not validating myth. They are dismantling it. At the same time, ancient DNA is not an oracle. It can tell us a great deal about ancestry and likely pigmentation, but it cannot fully recover appearance. Soft tissue, expression, grooming, health, age, and the countless social meanings attached to a face remain beyond its grasp. Nor can it explain by itself why a trait became desirable, ignored, or symbolically charged in human communities. Science can show that a Mesolithic forager likely carried the blue eye-associated variant. It cannot tell us how others responded to that person's gaze in life. That uncertainty matters. It prevents the data from becoming yet another modern fantasy. Still, the data has done enough to overturn an older, simpler story. Blue eyes are not merely a recent cosmetic flourish in otherwise familiar populations. They're a deep prehistoric inheritance that moves through hunter-gatherers, then survives successive waves of demographic change. The old human face in Europe and adjacent regions was more varied and more surprising than earlier generations of scholars imagined. Ancient DNA has exposed that surprise in detail. It has shown that later Europeans are not the first true carriers of the trait, but inheritors of a much older experiment in appearance. And perhaps the most striking experiment of all is the one that unsettles modern assumptions most completely. Because when ancient genomes began to be studied more closely, one possibility emerged that sounded, at first, almost contradictory, that some early Europeans may have had blue eyes while still carrying significantly darker skin pigmentation than later populations of the same broad regions. It is one thing to say that traits do not move together. It is another to realize that the ancient face itself may have combined them in ways that modern imagination had almost entirely ruled out. The idea is simple enough to state, and still strange enough to make people hesitate over it. Some of the earliest Europeans known from ancient DNA may have carried blue eye-associated variants, while also retaining significantly darker skin pigmentation than the lighter-skinned populations that later became common across much of Europe. It sounds contradictory only because modern habits of seeing have trained people to expect certain traits to belong together. Blue eyes, pale skin, and perhaps lighter hair are often imagined as parts of one coherent ancestral package, stretching backward into prehistory as though the old continent had always looked more or less like a softened version of itself today. Ancient DNA has made that picture much harder to defend. What survives in the record suggests something more unsettling and more interesting. The prehistoric face in Europe was assembled in stages, and some of its most familiar features did not arrive together. One of the most discussed examples is the Mesolithic individual known as Cheddar Man from Britain, whose reconstructed appearance drew intense public attention, not because the science was novel in principle, but because it clashed so sharply with inherited visual expectations. Genetic analysis suggested dark to dark brown skin pigmentation, dark hair, and likely blue or green eyes. Scholars still debate the precision of such reconstructions and how confidently specific shades should be assigned, because phenotype prediction from ancient DNA is probabilistic rather than photographic. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single reconstruction should be treated as a final portrait. Even so, the broader lesson is hard to escape. At least some hunter-gatherer populations in Western Europe appear to have combined darker skin with lighter eyes. That combination was not a fantasy or anomaly invented for modern provocation. It was a plausible part of prehistoric reality. This is where the origin of blue eyes becomes more than a story about one mutation. It becomes a challenge to the way modern societies imagine ancestry. People often assume that visible traits line up naturally according to the categories they know from recent centuries. But prehistory does not respect those categories. The human body carries traits with different evolutionary histories, and those traits can move through populations on different timelines. Skin depigmentation in Europe appears to have involved multiple genes and may have become more widespread later, especially with the spread of farming populations and continued selection in northern latitudes. The common blue eye mutation, by contrast, seems to have risen earlier in some hunter-gatherer groups. The result is a face that later Europe partly remembers and partly forgets. It remembers the blue eyes. It forgets the other features that once accompanied them. That forgetting has consequences. It encourages people to think of visible traits as fixed badges of identity, rather than historical accidents assembled through time. But the ancient evidence points the other way. A person standing on the edge of a lake in Mesolithic Europe may have had eyes that modern observers would instantly identify as blue, while carrying skin pigmentation that those same observers would not have associated with old Europe at all. The shock lies not in the science itself, but in the collapse of lazy assumptions. What survives in the record suggests that many modern visual associations are younger than they seem. The face modern Europe takes for granted is a later synthesis, not the first chapter. It is worth pausing on why darker skin persists so long in these ancient populations. Here again, simple stories fail. Human skin color is shaped by a complex interplay of ancestry, ultraviolet radiation, vitamin D metabolism, and sexual and demographic history. Populations entering Europe from Africa do not instantly become pale. Evolution does not respond overnight to latitude, and the selective pressures acting on skin are not identical to those acting on eyes. Some skin-lightening alleles that later become common in Europe seem to have been rare or absent in earlier hunter-gatherers, then rise substantially with later demographic change and selection. Scholars still debate the precise balance between migration and selection in this process. But the broad pattern is increasingly clear. Europe's lighter skin emerges gradually and unevenly. It does not arrive pre-assembled with blue eyes at the beginning. There is a deeply human irony in that. Later centuries would treat blue eyes as part of a supposedly self-evident northern or European look, yet the early carriers of the trait may have looked, in several other respects, unlike the later populations that romanticized it. That makes blue eyes a kind of historical orphan. The trait survives and becomes symbolically loaded, while much of the original facial context around it is altered by later migrations, mixing, and adaptation. By the time blue eyes are folded into medieval, early modern, and modern ideas of lineage and beauty, the world that first carried them has long vanished. The camps are gone, the drowned coasts forgotten, the dark-skinned hunter-gatherers of Atlantic and Northern Europe absorbed into deeper layers of ancestry. Only fragments remain, and one of the most visible is the iris. This also reveals how misleading it can be to use present-day frequency as a guide to ancient origin. A trait may become especially common in populations that are not the first to carry it. Blue eyes today are strongly associated with Northern and Eastern Europe, and with global populations descended from Europeans. But that distribution reflects later history as much as early emergence. The Mesolithic evidence suggests that hunter-gatherers may have been important early carriers, yet they are not the only ancestral layer in later Europeans. Farmers from Anatolia and adjacent regions bring other pigmentation patterns into Europe during the Neolithic. Later, steppe-associated migrations add still more ancestry. The face that finally emerges in many parts of Europe is therefore the outcome of repeated mixing events, not the preservation of one original type. Blue eyes survive through all this, but their meaning changes because the surrounding population changes. There is another reason this matters. It helps explain why ancient DNA has been so culturally disruptive. Many people are willing to accept that populations move and mix in theory, but visible traits feel personal. They are what people think they can see. When ancient genomes reveal that an early British or European hunter-gatherer may have had dark skin and blue eyes, the result is not just a scientific correction, it is an assault on visual intuition. The face of the past becomes harder to stereotype. That discomfort can provoke resistance, simplification, or ideological misuse from different directions. Some try to dismiss the evidence. Others exaggerate one result into a complete picture. The careful position is less satisfying and more truthful. Ancient appearance was varied, regional, and historically assembled, and the evidence remains incomplete in many places. But the broad lesson has only grown stronger with time. The ancient world did not look the way later myths wanted it to look. The combination of blue eyes and darker skin also exposes how separate evolutionary pathways can remain for surprisingly long periods. An eye color mutation may rise through one set of demographic circumstances. Skin-lightening alleles may spread later under different environmental and population conditions. Hair pigmentation may follow still another route. These timelines overlap, but they do not merge automatically. That is why the prehistoric face can look so unfamiliar when reconstructed carefully. It is a face in transition, carrying traits modern people treat as inseparable before they were actually joined by history. This transitional quality gives the story a different kind of beauty, not romantic beauty in the later cultural sense, but the beauty of complexity. The human face is not a finished artifact handed down whole from deep ancestry. It is a changing arrangement, assembled and reassembled by mutation, migration, mixing, and time. Blue eyes are one of its most visible reminders. They survive from an early mutation, pass through darker-skinned foragers, enter later populations with different ancestry, and eventually become common enough to seem ancient in a simpler way than they really are. The face modern people see in the mirror is therefore not a stable inheritance from one vanished people. It is a collage made by many vanished people. That collage becomes even more intricate once farming begins to spread across Europe. The arrival of early agricultural populations does not simply replace what came before, nor does it leave it untouched. Instead, it creates a new encounter between old hunter-gatherer lineages, newer farming ancestries, and later waves that have yet to arrive. In that process, blue eyes do not disappear. They pass into a more crowded and more mobile human landscape, where the old mutation continues its journey through a continent learning once again how to mix. When farming begins to move into Europe, the story of blue eyes enters a new kind of world. Until this point, the mutation has travelled mostly through the lives of hunter-gatherers, fishers, and small mobile communities shaped by rivers, forests, coasts, and seasonal return. Their inheritance patterns are already complex, but the scale of life remains relatively local. Then agriculture arrives, and with it come deeper changes in settlement, food production, demography, disease exposure, land use, and ancestry. Villages become more permanent. Fields replace wild margins. Population density rises. children grow up in landscapes more heavily altered by human intention. The old hunter-gatherer populations do not simply vanish, and the new farmers do not arrive into an empty continent. Instead, the two worlds meet, overlap, resist, exchange, and mix. Blue Eyes survive that meeting, but now they must do so inside a much larger demographic transformation. The first farmers entering Europe from Anatolia and adjacent regions bring more than crops and animals. They bring lineages shaped outside the older northern and western hunter-gatherer world. Their ancestry is different, their rhythms of life are different, and in many cases their visible traits appear different as well. Ancient DNA suggests that early farming populations often carried darker eyes on average than some of the Mesolithic foragers they encounter or replace. That point matters because it breaks any illusion that blue eyes were simply destined to rise uninterrupted across Europe once they appeared. For a time, the spread of farming may actually have diluted the frequency of the blue eye-associated variant in some regions, especially where incoming populations were numerous and local hunter-gatherers contributed less ancestry. The evidence remains incomplete and highly regional. But what survives in the record suggests a far more tangled process than the simple onward march of a successful trait. This is one of the quieter surprises in human history. A visible mutation may arise, persist, and even become regionally common, only to be partially submerged again when new populations expand into the same landscape. Europe during the Neolithic is full of such partial erasures. Hunter-gatherer ancestry shrinks in some places, survives more strongly in others, and later returns through admixture in ways that vary across the continent. Blue eyes carried substantially in some earlier foraging groups. Now move into communities where they're no longer just a family inheritance or a local regional feature. They become part of a continental negotiation between ways of life. Fields and forests meet. Villages and mobile camps meet. Old lineages enter new households. Children are born whose faces already contain more than one world. This mixing is not instantaneous harmony. The archaeological record suggests long periods of coexistence, boundary-making, exchange, and uneven integration. In some areas, hunter-gatherers and early farmers live near one another for generations without fully merging at once. In others, the process may be faster. Some foragers adopt elements of farming. Some farming groups absorb local people. Some regions become mosaics of ancestry and culture rather than clean replacements. No single explanation fully accounts for the pace of these encounters across all of Europe. Geography matters, so do ecology, population size, social structure, and the simple stubbornness of human communities. But wherever mixing happens, visible traits begin to recombine in new ways. Blue-eye variants pass into agricultural populations, while other pigmentation traits carried by those populations begin reshaping the face that inherits them. That recombination is one of the reasons later Europe looks the way it does. Blue eyes are not simply the relic of Mesolithic foragers surviving unchanged into the historical era. They are folded into the descendants of people who farm wheat, herd animals, clear woodland, build houses, bury their dead in new ways, and create denser patterns of settlement than much of earlier Europe had known. The mutation survives because the people carrying it are not sealed off from these changes. They marry, they mix, they become part of new communities whose ancestry is no longer singular. The face of Europe begins to lose the sharp distinction between forager and farmer, though the memory of both remains inside the genome. Then, later, another great movement alters the balance again. Steppe-associated populations expand westward from the Pontic-Caspian grasslands during the Bronze Age, bringing still another layer of ancestry into large parts of Europe. These groups are associated with major demographic change, mobility on a wider scale, and in many regions a significant genetic contribution to later populations. They do not arrive into a blank agricultural continent any more than the farmers arrived into a blank Mesolithic one. They enter a Europe already mixed, already transformed, already carrying the old blue-eye mutation through multiple lines. Their arrival adds further reshuffling. In some areas, this may help increase the frequency of lighter pigmentation traits overall. In others, it changes the local ancestry balance without producing the same visible outcome. Again, the pattern is not uniform. Europe is too ecologically and demographically varied for that. By this stage, blue eyes are no longer the inheritance of one narrow ancestral experiment. They are embedded in a continent of layered descent. Hunter-gatherers contribute one stream, early farmers contribute another. Steppe populations add a third major current, along with smaller and later flows in many regions besides. The familiar face associated with later Europeans emerges gradually from the meeting of these streams, not from the purity of any one of them. This is why the story becomes so revealing. A trait that later centuries will treat as emblematic of stable identity is, in reality, the survivor of repeated mixture. It persists not by resisting contact, but by moving through it. There is a human irony here that never really leaves the story. Blue eyes, which later imagination often turns into a symbol of ancient rootedness, are in fact a witness to instability. They survive ice and forest, foraging and farming, local isolation and long-range migration. They remain visible not because history protects them from change, but because history keeps recombining them with new populations. The evidence remains incomplete in certain regions, and scholars still debate the exact contribution of each major population wave to later eye color distributions. But the broad picture is difficult to escape. Blue eyes are not the inheritance of a single unbroken people. They are what remains visible after many peoples have already merged. This also helps explain why the modern distribution of blue eyes is broad but uneven. By the end of these prehistoric reshufflings, some regions have accumulated the necessary ancestry combinations and demographic histories to make the trait relatively common. Others have not. Frequency depends not only on whether the mutation once appeared there, but on how later migrations, population sizes, mate patterns, and local selection pressures reshaped its odds. A coastal northern zone with strong continuity from earlier populations may preserve the trait more readily than a southern region where different ancestry layers dominate. A later migration may amplify or dilute it depending on who moves and who leaves descendants. The human map is never static long enough for one mutation to write the same story everywhere. In practical terms, that means the rise of blue eyes belongs to the great prehistoric mixing events as much as to the original mutation itself. The first carrier begins the story, but later population encounters decide its scale. Without hunter-gatherer continuity, the mutation may have vanished. Without farming expansions and admixture, it may have remained more regionally confined. Without steppe-associated demographic change, later European pigmentation patterns might have looked different again. Each wave alters the face passed forward. The result is not a single ancestral look, but a population history layered so many times that modern people often mistake the final blend for the original. And this is where the story turns outward. Once blue eyes become established in substantial parts of Europe, they do not stay there in any pure or isolated sense. Trade, conquest, migration, colonization, and global movement will eventually carry them far beyond their prehistoric cradle. But even before that later expansion, there is a question already waiting inside Europe itself. Why does the trait become common in some areas and remain much rarer in others, even after all this mixing? If the mutation survives so well, why does it not spread evenly across the entire human world? The answer lies in the same forces that shaped it from the beginning: demography, geography, local history, and the stubborn fact that no visible trait, however striking, ever escapes the limits of where people live and with whom they have children. By the time blue eyes are firmly established in parts of Europe, the trait has already survived more than enough upheaval to seem almost unstoppable. It has passed through post-glacial hunters, through darker-skinned foragers whose appearance later centuries would forget, through the arrival of farmers, through the layering of steppe ancestry, through generations of mixture so extensive that no one population can honestly claim exclusive ownership of it. And yet, for all that resilience, blue eyes remain unevenly distributed. In some regions they become relatively common, in others they stay uncommon or rare. Beyond Europe and a few adjacent zones, they remain a minority trait on a global scale. That unevenness is important, because it reveals something fundamental about human variation. No visible feature spreads simply because it can. It spreads where history allows it to. Geography is part of that permission. Europe, especially its northern and eastern regions, provides a particular combination of ancient population bottlenecks, repeated local continuity, and later demographic reshuffling that helps preserve and amplify the blue eye-associated variant. Other regions do not necessarily offer the same sequence. A mutation that begins in a narrow prehistoric context can become common only if the surrounding population history repeatedly favors its survival. In much of Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania, the trait either never establishes itself early on or enters later at low frequency, through migration without the demographic conditions needed to make it widespread. That does not mean blue eyes are impossible there, only that rarity remains the rule. The evidence remains incomplete in some areas and more complex in admixed populations. But the broad pattern is clear enough. Blue eyes thrive where ancestry, movement, and local chance converge in the right way. Population size matters as much as geography. In smaller or moderately structured populations, rare variants can rise through drift, founder effects, or concentrated descent. In very large, highly connected populations where a trait begins at extremely low frequency, it is easier for that variant to remain rare unless strong selection pushes it upward. Blue eyes do not appear to have enjoyed such overwhelming universal selection. If they had, their global spread would likely look very different. Instead, their history suggests local amplification. The mutation does well in some human settings and poorly in others, not because it changes its nature, but because populations differ in scale, ancestry composition, and reproductive structure. What survives in the record suggests a trait dependent on demographic opportunity rather than unstoppable advantage. There is also the question of environment, though this remains one of the most debated areas. Some researchers have wondered whether northern light environments, lower ultraviolet exposure, or broader depigmentation processes indirectly helped create conditions in which lighter eyes persisted more easily. But scholars still debate how much direct environmental selection acts on eye color itself as opposed to skin pigmentation, and no single explanation fully accounts for the regional concentration of blue eyes. The temptation is always to turn Northern Europe into a simple adaptive machine, as though every visible feature there must have been carved into place by climate. The real story appears messier. Climate shapes populations, certainly, but often by shaping where people live, how they move, and how they mix rather than by cleanly selecting every trait one by one. Cultural patterns may also have mattered, though here again the evidence is frustratingly indirect. Marriage networks, endogamy, local mate preferences, and inherited social boundaries can all preserve certain traits within a region long after their original rise. If particular communities tend to marry within limited circles over many generations, visible features can remain regionally concentrated even without strong biological selection. This may help explain why blue eyes remain especially common in certain northern and eastern European populations across later history. The trait is not being preserved by isolation alone, because Europe is never fully isolated anywhere for long. But partial social continuity, layered over older demographic patterns, can maintain frequencies that would otherwise flatten out more quickly. At the same time, it is important not to exaggerate stability. Even in regions where blue eyes become common, they are rarely universal. Human populations are always more mixed than cultural storytelling admits. Travelers move, traders settle, raids, alliances, marriages, conquests, and seasonal labor all carry ancestry across boundaries. The face of Europe, like the face of every continent, remains in motion. Blue eyes persist not as a uniform blanket, but as one visible thread inside a much richer tapestry of brown, hazel, green, grey, and every intermediate shade. The modern tendency to reduce regions to a single dominant look says more about stereotype than biology. Beyond Europe, the rarity of blue eyes becomes even more revealing. In most of the world, dark eyes remain overwhelmingly dominant, just as they were for almost all of human history. This is not because other populations are somehow untouched by mutation or diversity, but because the specific ancient variant associated with common blue eyes never receives the same demographic lift. It may appear occasionally through later admixture, colonial history, or more recent migration, but those are late chapters. The global story still belongs mostly to brown-eyed humanity. That fact restores proportion. Blue eyes are striking and historically fascinating, but they are not the center of the species. They are a regional success story inside a much larger ancestral continuity. There are also rare medical or genetic conditions that can produce blue-looking or unusually light eyes outside the main prehistoric lineage story, sometimes through albinism, Waardenburg syndrome, or other pathways affecting pigmentation. These cases remind us that appearance can be altered in multiple ways, and that not all light eyes trace back neatly to the same historical demographic process. But such exceptions do not change the broader pattern. The common blue-eye trait that became concentrated in parts of Europe still reflects a specific ancient mutation moving through specific population histories. Its rarity elsewhere is not a mystery once the demographic logic is understood. Traits spread through people, and people do not move evenly across the world. This unevenness also exposes the weakness of any attempt to assign simple meaning to visible features. If blue eyes were a mark of some universal superiority, adaptation, or destiny, their distribution would not look so contingent. They would not depend so heavily on founder effects, regional ancestry, and the accidents of prehistoric Europe. Their very patchiness is evidence against grand myth. They are successful in some places because history happened there in a certain way, not because the trait itself carries an inherent claim on the human future. That should make the story more interesting, or not less. It shows how much of visible human diversity is built from local survivals that later became common enough to seem natural. In later centuries, of course, the trait will travel farther. European expansion, trade diasporas, settler colonialism, and global migration will carry blue eyes to the Americas, Australia, parts of southern Africa, and cities around the world. Today, a child born far from the mutation's prehistoric cradle may inherit blue eyes through ancestry stretched across oceans and empires. But that is a much later layer, one built on historical movement rather than ancient origin. The deeper question remains the older one. Why did blue eyes become common in some ancestral populations before modern globalization scattered them wider? The answer still points back to demography, geography, and time. There is no magic in it, only persistence. And perhaps that persistence is the strangest part. A mutation that begins in one forgotten prehistoric body survives because it remains just common enough, just attractive enough perhaps, just protected enough by lineage and local history to avoid extinction. It rises in some places, stalls in others, and never becomes the world's default. It stays regional. It stays contingent. It stays, in a sense, historical. That is why blue eyes are so revealing. They are not merely a colour. They are a map of where certain ancestors lived, whom they met, and how their descendants endured. But once a visible trait becomes widespread enough to enter memory and imagination, science is no longer the only force shaping its story. People begin telling stories about it. They romanticize it, rank it, fear it, idealize it, and eventually weaponize it. Blue eyes, like many human features, do not remain innocent in history. Later societies will load them with meanings their prehistoric origins never carried, and in doing so they will turn a simple ancient mutation into something far more distorted than biology ever intended. By the time blue eyes enter written history, they're no longer just a biological trait. They have become a surface onto which societies project meaning. This is one of the stranger fates of human appearance, a mutation that begins in silence, survives through forgotten families, crosses forests and coasts with prehistoric migrants, and persists through the mixing of hunter-gatherers, farmers, and steppe populations, eventually arrives in a world of poets, chroniclers, rulers, painters, nationalists, advertisers, and ideologues. In that world, the eye is no longer only an organ or an inherited colour. It becomes a symbol. It is read for beauty, innocence, nobility, coldness, danger, foreignness, purity, seduction, spirituality, and countless other invented meanings. Almost none of those meanings have anything to do with the mutation's real origin. Yet once attached, they are hard to remove. This is not unique to blue eyes. Human beings have always turned the body into narrative. Hair, skin, height, facial shape, scars, movement, voice, and colour become social language. They acquire moral and emotional associations far beyond their biological function. Blue eyes simply provide a particularly vivid example because the trait is both striking and unevenly distributed. In societies where they are common, they may seem normal and unremarkable. In societies where they are rarer, they can become exoticized or elevated. In periods obsessed with lineage, they can be recast as ancestral proof. In periods shaped by empire or race theory, they can be weaponized as evidence of imagined superiority. The evidence remains painfully clear on this point. Later history burdened blue eyes with meanings that prehistory never gave them. Even in older literary traditions, long before the pseudo-scientific racial systems of the modern era, Eye colour could be drawn into exaggeration. Light eyes might be used to signal strangeness, divine favour, beauty, severity, or outsider status depending on the culture and period. But these early symbolic uses were usually inconsistent. They belong to the fluid world of storytelling, where physical detail is often shorthand rather than doctrine. It is only much later, especially from the 18th century onward and then with terrifying force in the 19th and 20th centuries, that visible traits such as blue eyes are dragged into systematic ideologies of race. What had once been a local inherited variation becomes recoded as the sign of a supposedly ancient and superior type. This is where the story stops being merely inaccurate and becomes dangerous. The trouble begins with the human appetite for simplification. Once people want stable categories, they start treating visible features as if they reveal deep essence. Blue eyes, because they are obvious at a glance and associated with some European populations, become convenient. They are folded into fantasies of Nordic descent, purity of blood, and civilizational hierarchy. None of this stands up to the actual evidence. The real history of blue eyes is one of mixing, demographic accident, regional bottlenecks, and shifting combinations of traits that did not originally travel together. A blue-eyed person in prehistory might not have matched later European stereotypes in skin tone or overall appearance at all. The trait itself passed through multiple populations and survived because ancestry is messy. Yet ideology does not like mess. It takes a tangled inheritance and redraws it into a myth of origin. This myth reached one of its ugliest expressions in the racial politics of modern Europe. By the 19th century, and especially under the racial doctrines that culminated in Nazi ideology, blue eyes were held up as part of an idealized Aryan image, stripped of context, and welded to fantasies of biological worth. It is difficult to overstate how false this was. The ancient mutation behind common blue eyes did not arise in a pristine master population. It did not travel through an unbroken superior race. It emerged in prehistoric Eurasia, probably within a narrow founder context, then survived through repeated waves of mixture and adaptation. The modern attempt to transform that history into a badge of purity is not just morally abhorrent, it is scientifically absurd. And yet such myths were powerful precisely because they worked with visible simplicity. People trust what they think they can see. Eye colour looks immediate, effortless to classify, almost self-explanatory. That makes it especially vulnerable to misuse. A bureaucrat, propagandist, or casual bigot does not need genetics to turn the iris into a category. They only need a visual cue and a story. Blue eyes, blonde hair, pale skin. The modern racial imagination bundled these traits together and treated them as timeless markers. Ancient DNA has shown how badly that bundle distorts the past. But distortion is one of ideology's oldest skills. It takes regional traits and treats them as destiny. It takes demographic luck and treats it as moral rank. There is a quieter form of misuse too, less overtly political but still revealing. Blue eyes have often been romanticized in popular culture as inherently more beautiful, soulful, rare, or emotionally transparent than other eyes. These ideas are softer than racial doctrine, but they still detach the trait from history and turn it into a kind of aesthetic currency. Advertising, cinema, fashion photography, and mass media have repeatedly reinforced the notion that blue eyes are exceptional in themselves. In some contexts, they are associated with innocence, in others with danger or icy self-control. Either way, the eye becomes a screen for projection. This is not science. It is cultural storytelling attached to a trait whose original rise depended largely on inheritance and demographic chance. What makes all this especially ironic is that blue eyes are not even globally rare in the absolute sense. Modern romantic language sometimes implies they are regionally concentrated and globally a minority. Yes, but not some miraculous anomaly. They persist because ancient and later European histories made them common in certain populations. Their distinctiveness is real, but it is not mystical. The trait does not confer special depth of feeling or fixed personality. It does not reveal noble ancestry. It does not prove closeness to any ancient ideal. What survives in the record suggests something much more ordinary and more profound. At once, blue eyes are simply one visible remnant of deep human movement. There is also a modern identity problem hidden here. Many people understandably use ancestry, family resemblance, and inherited features as part of personal self-understanding. There is nothing inherently wrong with that. The trouble begins when a trait is treated as possession rather than inheritance, as proof rather than accident. Blue eyes may connect someone to certain lines of descent, especially within populations shaped by Europe's long demographic history, but they do not connect that person to a single simple people. The chain leads back into hunter-gatherers, farmers, steppe migrants, and countless later mixtures. It leads back into dark-eyed and brown-eyed ancestors too, because no visible trait moves through ancestry alone. Every blue-eyed person is also descended from overwhelming numbers of people who did not carry the trait at all. That is one of the strongest rebuttals to identity myth. An eye colour never tells the whole story of a face, and a face never tells the whole story of a lineage. Scholars still debate some details of how ancient populations carried and spread the blue eye-associated variant, and the evidence remains incomplete in many regions outside Europe's best-sampled areas. But on the larger question, the lesson is stable. Later symbolic uses of blue eyes say far more about the societies using them than about prehistory itself. The mutation did not ask to become an emblem. It became one because humans are meaning-making animals, and meaning often outruns truth. Perhaps the most useful way to understand this is to reverse the usual perspective. Instead of asking what blue eyes mean, ask what history did to them. History lifted them out of a narrow prehistoric origin, carried them through mixed populations, then turned them into symbols for beauty, class, race, nation, and fantasy. In other words, history buried the biology under layers of imagination. The work of science has been, in part, to uncover the older and less flattering reality beneath those layers. Not a glorious lineage, not a chosen people, just a mutation, a series of survivals, and a long, entangled human past. And that past is still moving. Blue eyes are no longer confined to the regions where they became most common. Empires, migrations, marriages, trade, displacement, and global modernity have carried them into new continents and new mixtures. The ancient mutation that once survived by clinging to fragile lineages in post-glacial Eurasia now circulates through a planetary world. Its meanings are still being rewritten, but its deeper story remains the same. A small prehistoric change continuing its journey through faces far removed from the landscapes where it began. What began in one forgotten body now circles the world. That is perhaps the most disorienting part of the story. The ancient mutation associated with common blue eyes likely emerges in a narrow prehistoric setting, survives through fragile family lines, spreads through hunter-gatherers, recombines through farmers and steppe migrants, and is later burdened with myths it never asked to carry. But history does not stop once a trait becomes regionally common. human movement continues, kingdoms rise. Trade routes widen, empires expand, ports fill, frontiers dissolve, ships cross oceans, settlers move, armies march, refugees flee, labourers relocate, and families form across distances that prehistoric people could not have imagined. Through all of this, the mutation keeps travelling. It leaves the northern rivers and post-glacial coasts that once sheltered it and enters a global human network where ancestry is increasingly mixed, mobile, and difficult to reduce to old maps. For much of recorded history, blue eyes remain concentrated in Europe and among populations shaped by European ancestry. But even within that broad statement, the pattern is never still. Medieval trade across the Baltic, North Sea, Mediterranean, and Eurasian routes carries people far from their birthplaces. Slavery, raiding, dynastic marriage, pilgrimage, mercenary service, and frontier settlement all redistribute ancestry in quieter ways than modern migration statistics can capture. A blue-eyed child may be born far from the regional heartlands of the trait, because one grandparent or great-grandparent crossed a sea, joined an army, entered a merchant quarter, or was taken from home under violence. Long before global modernity, eye colour is already moving through history in intimate and often unrecorded directions. Then the scale changes. European overseas expansion after the 15th century carries millions of people, willingly and unwillingly, across the Atlantic, around Africa, into Asia, into the Pacific, into the Southern Hemisphere, and eventually into nearly every major urban system on Earth. Colonialism, settler expansion, the Atlantic slave trade, indentured labour systems, war, mission networks, and later mass migration all reorder the human map. Blue eyes travel inside that upheaval, not as the central fact of it, but as one visible inheritance among many. A trait that once survived through tiny post-glacial communities now appears in port cities in the Americas, on settler frontiers in Australia and New Zealand, in colonial enclaves, in mixed families across continents, and later in global diasporas where ancestry is no longer geographically obedient. The mutation becomes planetary, not because it ceased to be local in origin, but because human history became planetary in movement. This is where the story becomes almost impossible to separate from the larger history of modern mixing. Today, blue eyes appear in places far removed from the ancient landscapes that first carried them in frequency. A person in Argentina, Canada, South Africa, the United States, Brazil, Australia. Or a major Asian city may inherit blue eyes through an ancestry line braided from several continents. In some cases, the trait persists clearly. In others, it appears unexpectedly after skipping generations. In others, it fades into hazel, grey, or green as the polygenic nature of pigmentation interacts with broader ancestry. The evidence remains incomplete if one asks for a perfectly simple global map. Because modern populations are too mobile and too mixed for simplicity. But what survives in the broad pattern suggests that blue eyes are no longer best understood as a regional endpoint. They are now part of a global circulation of human heredity. And yet even in this global circulation, the old logic remains visible. The trait still reflects ancestry. It still depends on inheritance. It still appears unevenly, because the ancient mutation and its related pigmentation context did not spread evenly into all populations. Globalization has redistributed blue eyes, not universalized them. Brown eyes remain the overwhelming majority condition in the human species, just as they were before the mutation arose. That continuity is worth remembering. Blue eyes can feel globally familiar now because modern media and migration have increased visibility. But visibility is not the same as prevalence. The ancient mutation has travelled far, yet it remains one branch of the human story rather than its centre. There is something strangely moving in that persistence across scale. The first carrier almost certainly lives in a world where the horizon is local, where the future means children, territory, food, weather, and neighbouring groups. Nothing in that life points toward airports, megacities, biometric passports, diaspora family trees, or classrooms filled with children whose grandparents come from 4 different continents. And yet the mutation survives long enough to enter exactly such a world. A detail once trapped in the intimate uncertainty of prehistory now appears under fluorescent lights in modern hospitals, in school portraits, in passport control lines, in wedding photos, in crowded trains, in digital images sent instantly across oceans. The old trait has not changed its origin, but the world carrying it has changed beyond recognition. This modern stage also weakens the old symbolic claims made about blue eyes. In a globally mixed world, the trait becomes harder and harder to recruit into narrow identity myths, even though some still try. Blue eyes now belong visibly to people whose ancestry is layered, partial, unexpected, and impossible to force back into the fantasies of earlier racial thinking. A person may inherit blue eyes from one line, dark hair from another, skin tone from several, facial structure from many more, and family stories that cross war, migration, exile, and reinvention. The human face reveals mixture more often than purity, and blue eyes in the modern world are no exception. In that sense, the mutation has outlived the ideologies that tried to trap it. It continues moving through exactly the kind of entangled humanity those ideologies failed to understand. The science of ancestry has sharpened that truth rather than softened it. Genetic testing, population genomics, and ancient DNA have all made it harder to believe that any visible trait can stand as a clean badge of origin. What they show instead is overlap, recombination, and the layered inheritance of traits through time. A blue-eyed person may carry ancestry from foragers, farmers, herders, imperial borderlands, medieval villages, enslaved or displaced populations, colonial encounters, and recent intercontinental marriages, all at once. The eye colour survives, but its historical meaning becomes more complex the more we learn. No single explanation fully accounts for any modern face, because every face is a crowded historical archive. At the same time, the mutation is still moving forward. Children are born every day with blue eyes into families where the trait has been present for generations, and into families where it arrives as a surprise after lying hidden or softened in ancestry lines for some time. Some blue-eyed children are born in places where the trait is common enough to pass without comment. Others are born where it draws immediate attention because it remains unusual. Some will grow up hearing romantic nonsense about what their eyes supposedly mean. Others will barely think about them at all. But in every case, the deeper reality is the same. Their appearance carries a prehistoric echo, not as myth, but as inheritance. Something that once emerged in silence is still being passed along. That continuity across such a vast stretch of time changes the scale of ordinary life. A person looking in the mirror today sees a present face, tied to immediate family and familiar identity. But hidden inside that casual moment is a long prehistoric journey. The eye colour staring back may trace, in part, to cold post-glacial landscapes, drowned coastlines, Mesolithic camps, ancient mixtures, Neolithic villages, Bronze Age migrations, medieval dispersals, imperial routes, and modern mobility. The trait is not a message from one pure ancestral people. It is a remnant of many forgotten survivals layered atop one another until they became part of the modern world. And that may be the most important thing Blue Eyes still teach. Not that one mutation can define a people, but that one small inherited change can survive so long that it exposes the fragility of all such definitions. A visible trait can outlast the languages, loyalties, and political categories later attached to it. It can move through people who would never have recognized one another as kin. It can become common, symbolic, misused, dispersed, and ordinary again. Blue Eyes are still moving through time because time keeps moving through us. What remains, then, is not simply the history of a colour, but the meaning of endurance itself. A tiny shift in pigment regulation becomes a visible inheritance carried across millennia, across collapse and migration, across forgetting and reinvention. That long survival does not prove greatness, only continuity, and continuity, in human history, is often the strangest achievement of all. In the end, the origin of Blue Eyes is not really a story about colour. Colour is only the visible trace, the thin surface where a much deeper history becomes briefly legible. The real story is about how small changes survive in a species that is constantly moving, mixing, and forgetting. Somewhere in prehistoric Eurasia, a mutation alters the regulation of pigment in the iris. By itself, that is almost nothing. It does not build a city, shape a religion, tame a crop, or redirect a river. It does not belong among the events historians usually call great, and yet it endures. It survives through children who are never named in any record, through camps erased by weather, through shorelines now drowned beneath cold water, through lineages that brush repeatedly against extinction and still continue. It survives the disappearance of the world that first carried it. That is what makes it so haunting. The mutation remains visible, even when almost everything else around its birth has vanished. Seen from that angle, Blue Eyes become a lesson in scale. Human beings tend to think history is driven by the loudest things: war, kingship, collapse, invention, conquest, revolution. And of course those forces matter. They change borders, institutions, language, memory. But below them, and often longer lasting than them, runs another kind of history, quieter and less theatrical. It is the history of inheritance, the way a jawline persists, the way a metabolism shifts, the way a disease resistance allele survives famine and plague, the way a small alteration in eye pigmentation moves from one body into millions. Blue Eyes belong to that quieter realm. They are the aftermath of an event so modest at the time of its appearance that no one who witnessed it could have recognized its future. That future, once unfolded, turns out to be tangled rather than triumphant. The mutation does not create a new people. It does not establish a clean ancestral line. It passes through darker-skinned hunter-gatherers, through post-glacial northern communities, through farmers and later steppe populations, through repeated mixture and recombination, until the familiar face of later Europe begins to emerge. Even then, the trait does not stop. It continues into medieval movement, imperial expansion, colonial violence, diaspora, and global modernity. By the time it reaches the present, Blue Eyes have travelled so far through so many populations that any attempt to assign them a simple meaning collapses under its own dishonesty. The history is too mixed for purity, too contingent for destiny, too human for myth. That may be the most valuable thing the story offers. It exposes the weakness of visual certainty. People look at a face and think they understand where it comes from. They see one trait and imagine a whole ancestry behind it. But the origin of blue eyes shows how misleading that instinct can be. One visible feature can survive while everything around it changes. It can move through bodies that would not resemble one another in other respects. It can become common in populations that were not the first to carry it. It can be detached from its earliest context and loaded with later meanings that have nothing to do with its actual rise. What survives in the record suggests that visible human appearance is less like a family crest and more like a layered archaeological site. Some things are ancient, some are recent, some were deposited by one population, some by another. The surface tells the truth only if one knows how to read the depth beneath it. There is also a strange humility in tracing the story back. The first carrier of the mutation is gone beyond recovery as a person. No one can name them. No one can tell whether they were admired or overlooked, whether they were healthy or fragile, whether they lived near a forested lake or a windswept shore, whether they died young or old. Their body is lost in the anonymity that claims almost every prehistoric life. And yet something in that body remains more durable than fame. The colour in millions of modern irises may still echo that ancient alteration. This does not make the unknown ancestor noble or chosen. It makes them real in a way history rarely permits. A forgotten person changes the future without ever knowing it. That forgottenness matters. It reminds us that prehistory is full of events whose consequences vastly exceed their visibility. A child survives who might have died. A family line endures one more winter than expected. A small band settles long enough on a rich coast to leave descendants rather than bones alone. A mutation persists. Human history is full of such threshold moments, but they do not announce themselves. Blue eyes are one of the few cases where the threshold can still be seen with the naked eye. That is why the trait feels so uncanny. It is not just old, it is visibly old, a surviving sign of deep time on the living face. And still, for all that depth, blue eyes do not stand apart from the rest of humanity. Quite the opposite. Their story folds back into the oldest human truth, which is mixture. Every blue-eyed person descends from overwhelming numbers of brown-eyed ancestors. Every lineage carrying the mutation has also carried countless people who did not express it at all. The trait persists only because it moves through populations, not around them. It belongs to the human species as a variation, not to any isolated essence. Brown eyes remain the deeper ancestral continuity, the global majority, the long-standing condition through which most human history has been lived. Blue eyes are a branch, not a root, a fascinating branch, a revealing one, but still only part of the tree. Perhaps that is why the story lingers so powerfully. It begins with difference, but ends in connection. A small mutation appears in one place and one body. Over thousands of years it is carried by people who cannot imagine the future faces they are helping to create. Those faces eventually appear in regions the mutation's first carriers never knew, inside languages not yet born, inside households built from many ancestries, under political systems and religions and technologies beyond any prehistoric dream. The trait keeps moving because humanity keeps moving. In that sense, blue eyes are not a monument to separation. They are evidence of continuity through change. And continuity through change may be the closest thing human beings ever have to permanence. Landscapes drown, populations are absorbed, memories fail, stories are rewritten. The meaning of visible traits shifts from age to age, often badly, yet inheritance goes on, quietly threading the past into the present. The origin of blue eyes, when stripped of fantasy, is the story of one such thread. It is ancient, accidental, fragile, and astonishingly durable. It reminds us that history does not only live in ruins and texts. Sometimes it looks back from the mirror. The blue in the human eye is, in the end, a very quiet thing. It does not thunder across history the way armies do. It does not leave walls, temples, inscriptions, or crowns. It leaves no ruin to stand inside, no broken city to excavate, no carved monument rising out of sand or forest, and yet it endures. It moves softly through time, carried in faces, carried in families, carried across distances so vast that the first people who bore it could never have imagined them. That may be why the story feels so haunting. It is a reminder that not all deep history survives as stone. Some of it survives as light. Somewhere, long ago, beneath colder skies, in a world of water, ice memory, dark forests, and small human camps, one ancient mutation begins its journey. Around it, almost everything disappears. The people vanish into ancestry. The camps rot away. The paths are swallowed by moss, river change, or the sea itself. Languages are lost before they are ever written. Whole ways of living fall silent, but the trait remains, moving onward through children and grandchildren, through strangers who do not know they are linked, through populations that mix, scatter, and begin again. What survives in the record suggests not a straight road, but a long, fragile crossing. And that is perhaps the most human part of all. Blue Eyes did not endure because history was gentle. They endured because life kept finding a way to continue through hardship, through movement, through uncertainty, through chance. The same can be said of so much else in the human story. We are made not only of the things that lasted by design, but of the things that lasted by accident, by survival, by one more birth, one more season, one more generation that did not end. So when the modern world looks into a blue eye, it is not really looking at rarity, beauty, or identity in any simple sense. It is looking at time made visible, at an inheritance older than nations, older than written memory in the places where it first spread, older than many of the stories later told about it. A tiny change in pigment regulation becomes a witness to migration, to mixing, to vanished ancestors, to the endless reshaping of the human face. And then the lens widens. Beyond one trait, beyond one colour, there is the larger truth waiting underneath it. Human beings are always passing through. Landscapes change, bodies change, meanings change, yet something of the distant past remains lodged inside the present, not as a perfect relic, but as a living continuation. A face in the mirror seems immediate, personal, familiar, but hidden inside it are drowned coastlines, cold dawns, forgotten camps, lost kin, and ancient futures no one saw coming. And among those faint survivals, still catching the light, are the eyes,